Adrian Cole spent 19 years learning exactly how money moves, and died owning almost none of it. He was 38. He traded commodities. Wheat, copper, crude oil, coffee, the dull things the world actually runs on. He grew up in a flat above a shop, where his mother counted coins onto the table every Thursday and came up short most weeks. That is a specific kind of education. You learn early that a price is not a number. It is something somebody needs and cannot wait for. He was very good. Not brilliant, not lucky. He simply noticed shortages about 4 days before anybody else did. He could look at a shipping delay in one country and tell you what bread would cost in another by the end of the month. His firm made $200 million on his reading of a drought season and paid him a bonus he described as polite. He never owned any of it. He was the man who found it. Other people owned it. In his 9th year, they promoted him, which meant his name began appearing on documents he had not written. One of those documents was a fraud. It was not his. And by the time anybody thought to ask, the man who wrote it had gone. There is a particular silence that happens when a room full of people quietly decide who is going to carry something. He sat in that room for 2 hours and watched it settle onto him, and understood that this was also a market. Reputation is a commodity. His had just been bought cheap by people who needed it more than he did. They walked him out at 4 in the afternoon with a cardboard box holding a mug and a photograph of nobody. The lawyers took 11 months. He won, technically, and it cost him everything he had saved by winning. 38 years old. No firm, no license, and a reputation with a permanent asterisk beside it. He took a job pricing scrap metal for a haulage firm, which he was overqualified for by roughly a factor of 1,000. He was good at that too. He always was. That was the entire problem. On a Tuesday in November, he was walking down the stairs of a building nobody important worked in, and his chest closed. He did not fall dramatically. He sat down on a step quite carefully and put his hand flat on the cold concrete. He had time for one clear thought, and it was not about his mother or his ex-wife or the 11 months of lawyers. It was this: I understood how money moved. I understood it better than almost anybody alive. And I never once owned anything. Not a shop, not a route, not one warehouse with my name over the door. I spent an entire life making other people rich, and I was excellent at it. If I ever get another one of these, he thought, I am going to own the thing. Then the stairwell went out, like a light being switched off at the wall. He woke up cold, on a straw mattress, in a room with a window that had no glass in it. The ceiling was wooden. There was frost on the inside of the shutter. Somewhere below, a woman was arguing with somebody about money. His first thought was hospital. His second was that hospitals do not smell of wood smoke and wet wool. His hands were wrong. Narrow wrists, unmarked knuckles, and not one callus anywhere on them. There was a shaving mirror on the chest beside the bed, the size of a playing card, and it took him a long moment to pick it up. The face in it was 19 years old, with the specific hollow look of somebody who has been eating badly for months. It was not his face, and he knew whose it was because the memories were already there, sitting behind his own like a second set of books. Vale, 19, second son of a merchant house in the river town of Brackmore on the wrong side of the water. His father had died in the autumn. Fever, or a bad heart, or both, the memory was vague in the way grief makes things vague. His older brother Tobias had gone south in the spring to settle a contract, and had simply never come back. And there was a third thing in the boy's memory, heavier than either, which he recognized immediately because he had spent a lifetime reading them. A debt. He sat on the edge of a straw mattress in a 19-year-old body, and began, without deciding to do arithmetic. This was not grief, and it was not panic. It was the thing he had always done instead of both. What is owed, to whom, by when? What can be sold, what cannot, and what the real deadline is as opposed to the stated one. He got downstairs on legs that did not belong to him, and found a woman of 52 at a table covered in paper. Her name was Merritt. She was his father's sister, and she had been holding the house together with both hands since the autumn. She looked up, and her face did a complicated thing. Relief first, then something a great deal more careful. She said he had been asleep for a day and a half, and that the physician had wanted 6 silver they did not have. Then she said the sentence that started everything. The guild comes in 30 days. Cashin asked to see the books. Merritt said there was nothing in them he did not already know. He said he would like to see them anyway. She handed him the ledger the way you hand somebody a death certificate. It was a very honest ledger. It was honest in the way a hole in a roof is honest. The Vale house owed the Ashford Trade Guild 18 gold, secured against the warehouse, the yard, and the house they were sitting in. Repayment fell due in 30 days. It had already been extended twice, which is not generosity. It is a guild waiting for an asset to ripen. Against that, the family's entire liquid position came to 2 gold and 41 silver. He read the number 3 times, not because it was bad, because it was interesting. 18 gold owed, 2 gold 41 in hand, 30 days. He needed to multiply his money by roughly 7, in 1 month, in a body he had been wearing for 2 hours. Merritt watched him read, and what she saw was a boy going quiet with fear. What was actually happening was a commodity trader building a position map. He asked her what the guild wanted more, the money or the warehouse. She said she did not understand the question. He said it was the only question and that he would explain later. Because a creditor who wants the money will take a plan. A creditor who wants your property refuses every plan you bring. He asked what stock was left. Merritt said, with the flatness of somebody who has already priced it, that there was nothing worth carrying out of the warehouse. He asked her to show him anyway. The Vale warehouse was long and cold, and about a fifth full, which is worse than empty, because empty at least looks deliberate. Gray light came in through a gap where the roof had shed 3 tiles, and nobody had been paid to replace them. Broken barrels stacked against the north wall, a handcart with a split axle, rope gone stiff with damp, 40 bolts of undyed wool cloth, coarse and unfashionable, sitting exactly where they had sat for 2 winters. Sacks of cheap grain, the low grade, the kind that goes to feed rather than to flour. 6 crates of clay lamps, of which perhaps a third were unbroken, which is a sentence that describes the entire family. And in the far corner, under a sheet of sacking, 11 ugly barrels that nobody had bothered to move. Merritt said his father had bought those last spring, and had not lived long enough to be embarrassed about them. Cashin walked the length of the building slowly, touching things, the way he had once walked a dockside at 4 in the morning. He was not despairing. He was taking inventory, and there is an enormous difference, though from outside they look identical. Old cloth, cheap grain, broken lamps, a cart that does not roll. On Earth he could have priced every item in this building in under a minute, and told you which of them was a trap. Here he had nothing. No exchange, no bulletins, no shipping data, no counterparties, and no idea what a silver piece even bought. He knew markets. He did not know this market. That gap was 30 days wide and 18 gold deep. He stood in the middle of his father's failed warehouse and said out loud, to nobody at all, that he would give anything for a price sheet. Something answered him. It did not speak. There was no voice, no light, and no sensation of being spoken to. A panel simply existed in the air in front of him, the way a word exists on a page, and had apparently always been there. Cashin did not shout or fall over or ask what it was. He had been handed unfamiliar instruments before. He read it, then he read it again, more slowly, the way he had once read his first trading terminal. Employees 0, trade routes 0. Influence 2, which was somehow more insulting than 0 would have been. Reputation unknown. He looked at that one for a while and decided he preferred it to the reputation he had died with. Then he turned to the nearest stack of goods, and the panel changed to meet it. -8%. 40 bolts of cloth that would cost the family money to sell, which most people do not know is possible. He moved to the grain. 4% less spoilage, less cartage, less the guild's interest. In practice, 0 arriving slowly. The lamps were worse. The cart was not an asset at all. It was a repair bill lying on its side. He went down the whole building item by item, and the building told him, politely and in detail, that it was worth nothing. This did not surprise him. Failing businesses are rarely sitting on hidden treasure. That is a story people tell about failing businesses. But he had one advantage he had never had on Earth, and it was not the panel. It was that nobody here had ever met a man who thought about price as a function of place. He crossed to the far corner and pulled the sacking off the 11 ugly barrels. 11 barrels of coarse mountain salt, unrefined, gray, and completely unremarkable. His father had paid 11 silver a barrel for salt that Brackmore would pay 9 for, which meant the last commercial decision of the man's life had been to lose 2 silver, 11 times in a row. Cashin stood in the cold with his hand on a barrel and asked the only question that had ever mattered in his profession. Not what is this worth, where is this worth more? The panel opened again, and this time it did not show him a price. It showed him 2. 9 silver here. 32 silver 3 weeks west on the far side of the pass. Westfall is inland. No coast, no river trade, no salt of its own, and a great deal of meat that has to be cured before winter. 6 silver to move a barrel there. 17 silver of margin on every one of them, on stock the family already owned. It was not a fortune. 11 barrels at 17 silver of margin came to under 2 gold, and he had no cart, no route, and no guard. Under 2 gold against 18 owed, not enough, not remotely enough. But it was the first true thing anybody in this family had known about their own stock in 2 years. And it meant the warehouse was not empty. It only looked empty to people who could not see where things were worth more. 18 gold, 30 days, 11 barrels of his father's worst decision. Vale put his hand back on the barrel, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, he started to laugh. Cashin told Merritt about the salt over a breakfast of black bread, and nothing else. He did not mention the panel. There is no version of that sentence that ends with somebody believing you. He told her instead that the salt was worth 3 times more in Westfall than in Brackmore, and that he meant to sell it. Merritt said everyone knew salt was cheap here and dear inland, and that this was not a discovery. It was geography, which was, he had to admit, an extremely good answer. So he asked her why, if everybody knew it, nobody in Brackmore was doing it. She said because the pass takes 3 weeks, the road has bandits, a cart costs 4 gold and a guard costs a silver a day. And because the last man in this family who tried something clever with salt was buried in the autumn. That stopped him. He decided it was fair and that he would earn the right to be listened to rather than argue for it. He said he was not going to travel. He was going to sell to somebody who was already going. Merritt put down her cup. She said the word for what he was describing did not exist in Brackmore. It existed on Earth, arbitrage, the same object in 2 places at 2 prices and a man willing to stand between them. He asked how much of the 2 gold 41 he could spend without killing them. She said 40 silver, and that if he lost it, they would be eating the seed stock by the new moon. He took 30, then he did the thing that mattered more than any of it, and asked her what a silver piece actually bought. Because he did not know. He knew markets in the abstract. He did not know what bread cost, or a nail, or a day of a man's labor. Merritt looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him, and he wrote every number down. They were interrupted by a knock that was too polite to be a neighbor. The man on the step introduced himself as Ledwin Ash, factor of the Ashford Trade Guild, and asked whether he might see the warehouse. He was 47, immaculate in a way Brackmore was not, and he carried an umbrella he did not need. Merritt said the debt was not due for 29 days. Ledwin agreed pleasantly that it was not. He said he was merely updating the guild's valuation of the security, which was standard and would take no time at all. Cashin understood the visit completely, because he had sat in rooms where the same thing was done in English. You do not value an asset you expect to be paid for. You value an asset you expect to take. Ledwin walked the warehouse with the case under his arm and wrote 3 lines in a small book. He did not look at the cloth. He did not look at the grain. He looked at the roof and the walls and the floor area. He was not pricing the stock, he was pricing the building. At the door he said he hoped very much that the family would find the money, in a voice that hoped nothing at all. Then he asked Cashin quite kindly what he intended to do about it. And Cashin, who had spent 19 years watching people give away their position for nothing, said that he had not decided. Ledwin smiled and said that was very sensible and left. Merritt shut the door and stood with her hand flat against it for a while. She said that was the 3rd visit since the autumn. Cashin asked what the first 2 had been about. She said the same thing, the roof, the walls, and the floor, which answered the question he had asked her the day before. The guild did not want the money. Brackmore on a market morning is 400 people, 1 square, a stone bridge, and a river the color of pewter. Cashin walked it for 3 hours with the panel open, and he was not shopping. He was calibrating. Bread, salt fish, iron nails, rough cloth, tallow candles, cartage by the mile, a day of a laboring man's time. He read every price against what Merritt had told him, and against what the panel said the 30-day average had been. By the 2nd hour, he had something nobody else in that square had, which was a sense of what normal looked like. And normal is the whole game. You cannot see that a thing is mispriced until you know what its price usually does. The panel gave him the month in 4 lines, and one of those lines did not belong with the others. Iron nails were up 11% on the month, and nobody had noticed because nobody buys nails twice. Tallow was down, salt fish was flat, and Cartage West had risen 19% since the autumn. He sat down on the bridge wall and thought about that last one for a long time. Cartage West rising in winter means either fewer carts or more freight, and those two facts point in opposite directions. Fewer carts is a problem. More freight is an opportunity. He could not yet tell which one he was looking at, but it told him where to stand, and that is most of what information is for. If Cartage West was expensive because carts were busy, then carts were going west, and every one of them had an owner who hated empty space. He asked a boy at the fish stall where the westbound caravan staged out of. The boy said the drovers rest out on the west road and asked for a copper and got one and looked astonished. Cashin told him the information had been worth more than that, and that he should charge more next time. It was the first piece of business advice he gave in that world, and he gave it away for nothing to a boy at a fish stall. Then he walked out along the west road in a cold wind with 30 silver in his belt, and no plan he would have been willing to describe out loud. The drover's rest was a long low inn with a walled yard, and the yard held 4 carts, 11 oxen, and a great deal of shouting. 3 of the carts were loading. One was not, and the one that was not had a man standing beside it with his arms folded. Garrow Ven was 44, built like a barrel with a beard on it, and he had the specific stillness of a man waiting for bad news. His cart was half full. Half full 4 days before the pass is not a cart, it is a loss with wheels. Cashin stopped at the yard gate and read him before he said a single word. Interest low, urgency high, trust very low. Urgency high with interest low is the most useful combination there is. It means a man needs something and does not think you have it. He walked over and asked what Garrow was carrying to Westfall. Garrow said that was his business. Cashin agreed that it was and asked whether the empty half of it was also his business. There was a pause of about 3 seconds in which the conversation could have ended. Then Garrow laughed once without much humor in it and said the boy had a mouth on him. Cashin said he had 11 barrels of mountain salt and no cart, and that their 2 problems looked like the same shape. Garrow said salt was 9 silver in this town, and that he would not haul another man's salt for a cut of 9 silver. Cashin said he did not want 9, he wanted 20 a barrel. Garrow unfolded his arms, which is what men do instead of laughing when something is genuinely funny. He said nobody in the world was paying 20 silver a barrel for coarse salt. And Cashin said, not here. The panel told him what he already suspected. The resistance was not about the price at all. Garrow was not refusing 20 silver because 20 silver was too much. He was refusing it because he did not believe the number behind it. On Earth, a man in that position discounts. He offers 18, then 16, and gives away his margin to buy a belief he cannot install. Cashin had watched it done badly for 19 years, and had done it badly himself for the first 4 of them. You do not answer the objection they say, you answer the one they have. So he did not lower the price, he removed the risk. He said Garrow should pay him 9 silver a barrel now, exactly what Brackmore pays, today at the yard in coin. If it sold in Westfall above 25, Garrow would pay him 11 more per barrel on his return. And if it did not, Garrow owed nothing further and had bought salt at the local price, which is not a loss in any language. Then he stopped talking, which is the hardest part, and let the silence do the arithmetic for him. Garrow Ven stood in a cold yard and worked out that he had been offered a position with no downside. Because he had, that was the entire design of it. His only cost was space in a cart that was going west empty. An empty space had already cost him everything it was going to. The resistance fell to 21% and the concern changed. And the new concern was a good one. He asked how a boy from a broken house was going to make him pay the 11 silver when he came back. Cashin said he was not going to, the guild would, because the caravan was guild registered, and a registered carrier who breaks a written term loses the registration. And a registration is worth a great deal more than 121 silver. Garrow looked at him for a while and said he did not talk like a boy from a broken house. Cashin said he had been taught by a man who never owned anything and left it at that. They wrote it at a table in the inn. On a standard carrier's form, Garrow kept folded inside his coat. 14 clauses, 2 dangerous, 3 ambiguous. Cashin read every one of them twice. The first valued any goods lost on the road at the price of origin, which meant 9 silver a barrel, not 20. Under that clause, the cart could be robbed. Garrow would owe him nothing and would have been paid for the space regardless. The second let the carrier settle in kind rather than coin, which in Westfall means being paid in cured, meet 3 weeks from a guild deadline. The ambiguous 3 were merely sloppy. Sloppy clauses are not traps, they are doors, and he left 2 of them open on purpose. He struck the origin price clause and wrote loss at destination value. Garrow argued for a while and then agreed, because it was fair. He struck settlement in kind entirely, and Garrow did not argue at all, which told him that clause had been there on purpose. Then they signed it, and Garrow counted 99 silver into his hand, coin by coin in a cold yard in front of 11 oxen. 11 barrels bought at 11, contracted at 20. A return of 81.8% if the second half ever arrived. It was not a fortune. 99 silver against 18 gold, and the rest of it 3 weeks away over a bandit road. The laborers rolled the 11 barrels up the plank into the empty half of a cart that was no longer empty. But something else happened in that yard, and it mattered a great deal more than the coin did. Market analysis moved from 3 to 4, and a thing called price radius opened, and the world got 50 kilometers wider. Cashin turned north out of pure habit, and the country around him quietly filled itself in. Coarse feed grain, the worthless sacks in his own warehouse. 3 times the price, 41 kilometers north at an army garrison. And the volume they were buying had gone up 340% in 20 days. Cashin Vale stood very still in a cold yard and stopped thinking about salt entirely. Because nobody stockpiles feed grain in winter. You stockpile feed grain when you are about to need a very great many horses. Cashin got back to the house after dark with 99 silver, and a number he could not stop looking at. Merritt counted the coins twice, and said it was the most money the house had held since the spring. Then he told her he intended to spend nearly all of it before the week was out, and she stopped being pleased. He said the garrison at Ostwick was buying coarse feed grain at 3 times what Brackmore pays for it. Merritt said Ostwick was 40 kilometers of bad road, and that soldiers do not pay merchants. They requisition from them. He said that was a real objection, and he would come back to it. First, he wanted her to look at something. The 40 sacks in their own warehouse were worth about 80 silver in Brackmore, which was as close to nothing as made no difference. At Ostwick, the same 40 sacks were worth 240. Merritt did the arithmetic faster than he expected, and said 160 silver less the road. And Cashin said no. He said that was the small version, and the small version was how his father had died poor. Because the opportunity was not the 40 sacks. The opportunity was that nobody else in Brackmore knew. Feed grain in that town was worth 2 silver a sack, because nothing in that town needed feeding in February. Every mill, every farm, and every barn on that river had the stuff sitting in a corner, going slowly damp, priced at nothing. And 41 kilometers north, an army was quietly buying every bag of it could find. Merritt sat down on the bench. She said slowly that he wanted to buy grain. He said he wanted to buy all of it. There was a long silence, in which a woman of 52 rearranged what she thought her nephew was. Then she asked him what he needed, which is the first time in the whole story that anybody helped him on purpose. What he needed, as it turned out, was a cart. The handcart had a split axle, and had been lying on its side since before the funeral. It had been furniture for 4 months. He had walked past it 11 times and never once asked the only useful question. 8 silver to a wheelwright, against 4 gold to buy one. He had been staring at an asset and seeing a corpse. That is the most common error in commerce, and it is not a clever one. It is simply never asking. He needed an animal, and he did not have 4 gold for an ox, so he hired one. 12 silver, 3 days. And he needed a second pair of hands, because 80 sacks do not load themselves, and he weighed 60 kilos. He walked into the square on the Tuesday, and found the boy from the fish stall. His name was Pell. He was 13, he could not read, and he had sold Cashin the location of the drover's rest for 1 copper. Cashin offered him 3 silver for 6 days, and the boy asked, quite seriously, what the catch was. He said the catch was that they might both be wrong and walk 40 kilometers for nothing. Pell said he had walked further than that for less, and took the job. The panel updated a line that had read 0 since the day it opened, and Cashin looked at it for longer than he meant to. Employees, 1. On any honest accounting, it was the least impressive number in the entire document. Then they went shopping, and he did it the way you do it when a price is low only because nobody has asked yet. Rule 1, never buy it all in one place. Rule 2, never tell anybody why. Rule 3, pay slightly over the asking price because a seller who feels clever does not go looking for the reason. They started at the Bram Mill, 2 miles up the river, where a woman of 61 had 11 sacks going damp in a lean-to. Hesta Bram had been milling on that water since before Cashin's father was born, and she did not like being called on. Interest low, urgency low, trust moderate. It was the worst set of numbers he had seen. A seller with no urgency has all the time in the world to wonder what you are doing. So he did not haggle at all. He asked her price for the 11 sacks and paid it without a word. Hesta asked what a Vale wanted with feed grain in February. And Cashin, who had prepared 4 lies on the walk-up and discarded all of them, told her a piece of the truth. He said he had a buyer north who paid better than Brackmore, and that he would rather she heard it from him than from a rumor. Her trust went up, which he had not expected, and taught him something he wrote down that night. In a town of 400 people, a lie is a liability with a due date. The truth, rationed carefully, is cheaper. She sold him the 11 sacks, and then told him which 3 farms up the valley had grain they were ashamed of. That sentence was worth considerably more than the grain was. Over 4 days, they walked 90 kilometers of lanes and bought 47 sacks from 9 different sellers. Nobody thought it strange, because nobody sells 11 sacks of damp feed grain and then discusses it at length. Only one man asked the dangerous question. A cooper on the East Lane who wanted to know whether the army was buying. Cashin said he had no idea what the army was doing, which was, by that point, an outright lie. He paid the man his asking price plus a copper a sack and left quickly. That night he wrote the cooper's name in the back of the ledger, because a man who asks the right question once will ask it again. By the Friday, 87 sacks stood in the Vale warehouse, and 103 silver had gone out of the box. Merritt looked at the stacked sacks filling a building that had stood empty for 2 years, and did not say anything at all. She just stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth, which Cashin understood, because the building had not looked like that since her brother was alive. That night he asked the panel about the road north, and it gave him 2 of them. A day faster, or a 14% chance of losing every single thing he owned. On Earth he had priced risk for a living. 14% of everything was not worth 1 day. He took the long road. It is worth saying plainly that this decision was boring, and that boring decisions are what actually build companies. They left before light on the Saturday with 87 sacks, a hired ox, a mended axle, and a 13-year-old. The North Road runs up the river valley through country that has been poor for a very long time. Frost in the ruts, bare hedges, villages of 11 houses, nobody on the road at all in February, except that there were people on the road. On the second day they passed 2 supply wagons heading north, then 4, then a column of 11 with an armed escort. Pell counted them out loud, because he had never seen so many carts going the same way. Cashin counted them too, and did not say what he was counting, because supply moves before soldiers do, always. It is the most reliable signal there is, and almost nobody reads it. Grain, then fodder, then timber, then men. He was watching the second stage of something from the inside of it. On the 3rd afternoon they came over a rise and saw Ostwick. Ostwick Garrison is a gray stone rectangle on a hill, with a town leaning against it for warmth, and the yard below it held more horses than Cashin had seen in one place in either of his lives. Pell said there must be 1,000. There were about 400, which was worse, because 400 is a number somebody chose. 6 silver a sack, 87 sacks, 522 silver against 103 spent. He walked into the quartermaster's store with the confidence of a man who has done his arithmetic, and was stopped in 4 words. Quartermaster Ren Doric was 51, and he said the garrison bought from the guild. Not from merchants, not from farmers, from the Ashford Trade Guild on a standing contract at a fixed rate. Cashin stood in a cold stone room, and felt the entire week collapse quietly underneath him. He had been so pleased with the information that he never once checked whether he was allowed to act on it. That is a beginner's error, and he had made it at 38 as well twice, and been forgiven both times by a firm that no longer exists. So he did the only thing left, which was to stop selling and start asking. He asked Doric how much grain the standing contract delivered each month. Doric, who was bored and cold and had nothing better to do, told him. Then Cashin asked how much the garrison was actually going through. There was a pause. Doric looked at him properly for the first time. The contract delivered 400 sacks a month. The garrison was burning through 650. The guild was not short-changing them. The guild simply could not get grain north fast enough because the guild had also been surprised. which meant there was a gap of 250 sacks a month that the contract did not cover and could not. And a standing contract, as he had learned reading 14 clauses by candlelight, covers exactly what it says and nothing whatsoever else. He asked whether the contract forbade the garrison from buying anywhere else. Doric went and got the contract. 22 clauses, no exclusivity anywhere in it. The guild had never written one because the guild had never needed one. Nobody writes a clause against a competitor who does not exist. Doric bought all 87 sacks at 6 silver, paid out of the garrison chest, and asked when he could get more. 522 silver. He walked out of Ostwick with 5 gold 22 and a standing request he had no way to fill. Appraisal went to 5. Logistics went to 3. And a line at the bottom of the profile changed from 0 to 1. Trade routes 1. Brackmore to Ostwick, 41 kilometers of frozen mud, and it was his. On the road back, he did the sum he had been avoiding for 3 days. 250 sacks a month at 4 silver of margin is 1,000 silver. 10 gold every single month. But nobody in Brackmore had 250 sacks a month. And nobody had anywhere to put them if they did. Nobody except a family with a long stone warehouse, standing empty on the road north. Cashin stopped the cart in the middle of an empty road, and sat there while Pell asked him twice what was wrong. Because Ledwin Ash had walked that building with a notebook and measured the roof, the walls, and the floor. He had not been valuing a debt. He had been buying the only dry storage on the North Road, 3 weeks before anybody else worked out what it was for. The 18 gold was never the point. The 18 gold was the price of a key. Pell asked whether they had done something wrong. Cashin said no. He said they had done something extremely right far too early. 26 days left. 5 gold 22 in his belt against 18 owed, and a buyer who wanted everything he could carry. And a guild that had been very carefully buying his family's building for 4 months, and did not know he had noticed. Which was, for the first time since he had woken up in that cold room, an actual advantage. He had 26 days to work out what a man does when he finds out he is standing on the thing everybody wants. They got back to Brackmore on the 11th day with an empty cart and 5 gold 22. Merritt counted it 3 times, then sat down, which is what people do when a number stops being frightening and starts being real. 19 days left, 18 gold owed, 5 gold 22 in the box. It was the best position the family had held in 2 years, and it was still losing. Because 522 is not 18, and there was no more grain in Brackmore to buy. He had taken 87 of perhaps 120 sacks in the valley. The rest belonged to people who needed them. The garrison wanted 250 sacks a month. He had cornered a market that turned out to be a puddle, which is the second most common error in commerce, and he had walked into it at a run. You do not solve a supply problem by buying harder. You solve it by widening what counts as supply. So he pulled a clean sheet toward him and asked a different question. Not what does the garrison buy, what does the garrison need? 400 horses do not only eat grain, they eat hay and straw and oats. They wear shoes which wear out, which needs iron and nails and a farrier's time. They need harness, and harness needs leather and thread and buckles. And the men who ride them need salt and boots and lamp oil and 1,000 other dull things. The panel filled in a column he had not thought to ask for, and the grain was not even the best line on it. Hay was 4 times Brackmore, straw nearly 3, oats 3.5. He had spent 4 days walking 90 kilometers to corner the cheapest thing on the entire list. Merritt asked what was wrong because he had put his head in his hands. What was wrong was the nails. 3 weeks earlier, standing in the market square with a stub of charcoal, he had written down that iron nails were up 11%. He had noticed it, recorded it, found it interesting, and done absolutely nothing about it. Because nobody buys nails twice, and he had been busy being clever about salt. Iron does not rise 11% in a river town in winter for no reason. It rises because somebody with money has been quietly buying it for a month before anybody else notices. And the only body in that province with that kind of money was the Ashford Trade Guild, which meant the guild had known about Ostwick before he did, weeks before. They had been positioning while he was still asleep in a body he had not yet woken up in. That was not a comfortable thought, and he made himself sit with it until it stopped stinging. Then he wrote the useful version of it underneath. The guild knew first. The guild bought iron. The guild took the supply contract, and the guild still could not deliver. Whatever advantage they had, it was not execution. It was information and capital, and they had wasted both. Somebody in that guild had seen a shortage coming and responded by signing a fixed-volume contract. That is not a merchant's move, it is a clerk's move. And Cash and Vale, who had spent 19 years watching clerks make exactly that move, stopped being afraid of them at that table, which left the only real problem, which was money. To supply that gap, he needed hay and straw and oats across 3 valleys, and he had 5 gold 22. He needed perhaps 40 gold of stock, and no lender in Brackmore would give a Vale 40 coppers. On Earth, this is where you go to a bank, and the bank asks for security, and you have none. But there is another place to get working capital, and almost nobody thinks of it, because it does not feel like borrowing. You get it from your customer. He was back on the North Road at first light on the 13th day, with Pell and no cargo at all. Pell asked what they were selling. Cashin said nothing at all, and that this was the point. Doric did not recognize him for a moment, because a man arriving with nothing is a different shape from a man arriving with a cart. Cashin did not offer to sell him anything. He offered to solve his problem. He said the garrison was 250 sacks short every month, and the guild could not close it. He said he could close it. Grain, hay, straw, and oats in 4 consignments across the month. Doric said that was a fine speech, and asked what the catch was. Cashin said the catch was that he needed 60% in advance, because he could not buy it otherwise. Interest high, urgency high, trust low. Resistance 66%, and the concern was not the money. Doric was not worried about paying early. He was worried about paying early to a 19-year-old he had met twice. So he did what he had done in a cold yard with an ox. He did not argue, he restructured. He offered the warehouse as security, written into the contract at the guild's own valuation. If he failed to deliver, the garrison took the building, which was, on any reading, an insane thing to offer, and he made the offer with a completely steady voice. Because he had read the guild's contract and understood something Doric had not. A garrison holding a lien on the only dry storage on the North Road is a garrison the guild has to negotiate with. He was not offering security. He was selling Doric a position and letting him think it was collateral. The resistance fell to 19, and what was left of it was about hay going damp. Doric wrote the contract himself in his own hand, and Cashin read it twice and struck 1 clause about spoilage. Then a quartermaster counted 24 gold out of an army chest and handed it to a boy from a fish stall to carry. 29 gold, 22 silver. 11 days earlier, the entire family had held 2 gold 41, and every coin of it was somebody else's, owed against a delivery he had not yet bought. That distinction mattered more than anything else in the ledger, and he wrote it at the top of the page that night. Capital is not money. Capital is money you are allowed to lose. He hired Adrian Cole, who was 34, had driven for the river trade 11 years, and had been out of work since the autumn. The panel rated him. Logistics A, reliability B+, sales D, accounting D-, which told him exactly one useful thing, which was never to let Adrian Cole near a customer or a ledger. He put him in charge of carts and animals, and told him to hire 4 men he trusted. Adrian asked what the wage was. Cashin said a silver a day, which was over the going rate. Adrian asked why. Cashin said because he intended to still have them in a year. It was the first sentence he said in that world that was about building something rather than winning something. Over 4 days, they bought across 3 valleys with money that was not theirs. Hay from 6 farms, straw from 11, oats from a factor at Weir Bridge who thought he was fleecing a boy. Cashin let him win 8 silver on the oats, deliberately, because he intended to buy from that man every month for 10 years. Pell learned to count sacks. Adrian learned that his employer walked every load personally and knew what everything weighed. And Merritt, without being asked, took over the ledger and did it better than Cashin did. Accounting a -. Reliability A. He had been paying a boy 3 silver and had never thought to look in his own kitchen. He made her a partner that evening, out loud, in front of Adrian and the boy, which cost nothing and changed everything. Merritt did not say anything. She wrote it into the ledger herself in her own hand and underlined it twice. By the 17th day, the Vale warehouse held 260 sacks of grain, hay, straw, and oats. 6 men, 2 carts, 4 oxen, and a 13-year-old were working out of a yard that had been silent since the autumn. Employees 6, trade routes 1, and influence, whatever influence is, had gone from 2 to 19, and 13 days remained. Ledwin Ash came on the evening of the 17th day, and this time he did not ask to see the warehouse. He already knew what was in it. He said so pleasantly, standing in the yard while men worked behind him. He congratulated Cashin on a remarkable fortnight and asked whether he understood what he had done. Cashin said he had bought some hay. Ledwin smiled and said that was very good. Then he stopped smiling, which was considerably worse. He said the guild had held the Ostwick supply for 9 years. He said it was not a contract, it was a relationship. He said a boy with 1 cart, and a Leon could not be permitted to sit inside it. Then he made an offer, and the offer was genuinely generous, which is how Cashin knew he was frightened. The guild would forgive the 18 gold entirely, in exchange for the warehouse and the yard. The family would keep the house, Merritt would keep her home, the debt would vanish in an afternoon. On any ordinary accounting, it was the best offer the Vale family had received in 10 years, and a number was sitting in the air over Ledwin's shoulder that Cashin had asked for without meaning to. 22 gold as a building, 400 and more as a position. The guild was offering to forgive 18 gold for something worth 20 times that, and calling it mercy. Cashin said no, thanked him for coming, and offered him tea, which was possibly the most aggressive thing he had ever done. Ledwin put his gloves back on very slowly. He said he hoped the delivery went well. He said winter roads were unpredictable and that a great deal could happen in 13 days. He said it in exactly the voice a man uses when he has already decided what is going to happen. He walked out through a yard full of working men and did not look at a single one of them. Merritt asked whether that had been a threat. Cashin said it had been a schedule, because a man who wants your building in 13 days does not wait until the 13th. He waits until the carts are loaded, and the money is spent, and every coin the family has is standing in a warehouse as hay, which is exactly what Cashin had done to himself, on purpose, 4 days earlier. 24 gold of somebody else's money, converted into fodder, sitting in a building somebody else wants. He had built the trap, filled it, and climbed into it, and he had 13 days to find out whether he had also built the door. Merritt asked what they should do. He said they should sleep and set a watch on the warehouse and start before light. The watch was Oren's idea, and Cashin agreed to it in the yard without thinking very hard about why. In 11 days, he would understand that it was the single most valuable decision anybody made that winter. The first consignment went north on the 18th day, and everything about it went right. Adrian Cole drove the long road, the safe one, and did not once suggest the short one. 3 days out, 3 days back, and not one bale lost to weather or anybody else. Doric counted every sack himself, found the tally correct, and looked almost disappointed about it. He paid the remaining 40% out of the chest without argument, and said the second consignment could be larger. Larger, it is a small word, and it did more damage to Cashin Vale than any threat Ledwin Ash ever made. They counted it at the kitchen table on the 21st day, and for the first time the arithmetic was pleasant. 40 gold and change, debt 18. For one evening the Vale family was solvent. Merritt said they should pay the guild tomorrow and be done with it. It was, in every respect that mattered, the correct decision, and Cashin explained very clearly why they were not going to make it. Pay the debt now, and they were a family with no debt, no stock, and no money, on the day the second consignment was due. Buy stock now, deliver twice more, and they would pay the 18 out of a fortnight's margin and keep the building. Merritt asked what happened if the second delivery did not sell. Cashin said it was already sold, which was true, and not the question she had asked. He was not lying to her. He was doing something considerably more dangerous, which is answering a hard question with an easy one. So they went out again, and this time the valley had noticed them. Hay that had cost 2 silver a bale in the first week cost 3 in the third, and the farmers were not being greedy. They were being observant. A buyer who comes back is a buyer who made money, and every seller in 3 valleys had worked that out inside a fortnight. The panel gave him a range and a confidence, the way it always had. 5 to 9 silver, confidence 61%, demand driver a military muster, duration unknown. He read the 9. He did not read the 5, and he did not read duration unknown at all. 61% is not a promise. It is a coin weighted slightly in your favor, and he had once explained that to other people for a living. He bought at 3 silver, then at 3.5, then on the 23rd day at 4. Oren asked once whether they were buying rather a lot. Cashin said the garrison would take everything they could carry. Adrian Cole had driven for the river trade for 11 years, and knew better than to ask an employer twice. That silence cost the Vale family a great deal, and it was not Oren's fault. It was the fault of the man who had made it unsafe to speak. By the 24th day, the warehouse held 410 sacks and bales, against a contract for 250. 160 of them belonged to nobody but Cash and Vale, bought on the belief that a number would stay where it was. Merritt walked the aisles with the ledger and said quietly that they had spent 31 gold on stock they had not sold. He said it was not spending, he said it was a position. Merritt, who had kept a household alive on nothing for 4 months, wrote the number down and did not argue. She had learned in one fortnight that arguing with him did not work, which is a thing that happens to people who are right too often. The watch caught somebody on the night of the 25th. Not an arsonist, not a thief, a man in a plain hood with a tally stick and a piece of chalk. He was not breaking in, he was counting. Cashin came out barefoot into the frost and looked at the tally stick for a long time. It was notched down one side in 5s, and the total was almost exactly right. Somebody had been counting his stock at night, carefully, for at least 3 nights. He let the man go, which surprised everybody in the yard, including the man. Oren asked why. Cashin said because a man who wanted the building burned would have brought oil, and this one brought chalk. Ledwin Ash did not want the warehouse empty. He wanted it full, and he wanted to know exactly how full, which meant the guild intended to buy this stock, not destroy it. And you only buy stock cheaply from a man who has to sell. He stood in the yard in his bare feet and understood that something was coming that he had not priced. He did not know what. He spent the rest of that night awake, asking the panel questions, and the panel told him what it always told him. A range, a confidence, and one line he had never seen before. Downside driver, unidentified. Insufficient information at this level. The system had just told him, in plain terms, that something existed which he could not see, and he had no way to make it show him. On Earth, that was the moment you reduced the position. He knew it exactly. And he had 4 days to a delivery. 31 gold standing in a building as hay, and 5 days to a debt. There was no version of reducing that did not mean selling into Brackmore at 2 silver, and taking the loss himself tonight. So he did what almost everybody does, which is nothing, and told himself it was patience. The news reached Brackmore Market on the morning of the 26th day, in the ordinary way, which is to say from a carter who had heard it from somebody else. Pell heard it first, because a boy who has spent his life at a fish stall hears everything first. He ran the whole way back and could not get the words out in the right order, so he said the important one first. Granaries. The Crown had opened the Royal Reserve granaries at Fenno, and was supplying the northern mustard directly from its own stores, at its own cost, which meant Ostwick did not need to buy fodder on the open market, not this month, possibly not for a year. A crown does not announce a thing like that in advance, because announcing it in advance makes it cost more. But somebody with a seat close enough to the crown would have known it was being discussed. Weeks ago. A great deal can happen in 13 days, Ledwin Ash had said, in a yard in the dark with his gloves half on. Cashin had heard a threat, and had set a watch on a building and had bought an axe handle. The attack had never been coming through the door. It had come through a granary 200 kilometers away, and it had left 3 weeks earlier. He took 1 cart north the next morning to find out how bad it was, which is the last thing a man in his position should do, and the only thing he could stand to do. The road told him before Ostwick did. There were no supply wagons on it at all. 8 days earlier he had counted 11 in a column with an escort. Now there was frost lying unbroken in the ruts. Doric was almost kind about it, which was worse than anything else that happened that week. He said the contract stood. 250 sacks at the agreed price, and he would take every one of them and pay in full. And then he said that he could not take 1 sack more than the contract, at any price, because the garrison no longer needed to buy. Cashin said he understood and thanked him, and asked 1 question, because it was the only thing left worth having. He asked when Doric had first been told the granaries might open. Doric said a guild factor had asked him the same thing, in this room, 19 days ago. 19 days ago was 2 days before Ledwin Ash first walked the Vale warehouse with a notebook. They did the arithmetic at the kitchen table on the 28th day, and Merritt did it, because he could not. The contract stock sold at 6 silver, exactly as agreed, and paid what it had always been going to pay. The other 160 bales were worth whatever Brackmore would give, which was 2 silver, and Brackmore did not want them either. Merritt put the charcoal down and said the number out loud once, because saying it once is better than reading it 11 times. Minus 42%. 31 gold in. 18 out if he could find anybody at all who wanted winter fodder in a province that had stopped needing it. The system had shown him a range with a 58% confidence and a line marked unidentified, and he had read the top of the range and stopped. It had not lied to him. It had not even been wrong. It had told him precisely how much it did not know, and he had chosen not to hear it. Merritt asked whether they had lost the building. He said not yet. She asked what not yet meant. It meant 2 days. He went out to the warehouse that night and walked the aisles by lantern, past 410 sacks and bales of an entirely worthless commodity. It was not spoiled. It was not stolen. It was in perfect condition in a dry building on a good road, and nobody on earth wanted it. That is the specific cruelty of a market. It does not punish you for being careless. It punishes you for being early or late or simply unlucky. He had been careful. He had done the work. He had checked the contract, walked the road, hired well, and paid over the rate. And he had lost 13 gold in 9 days, because a man he had met 3 times had known something first. Adrian Cole had lost more than that in an afternoon twice, and had gone home and slept. But Adrian Cole had never lost a house that somebody's aunt was living in. Oren was on the stool by the doors, awake, with the blanket over his knees and the axe leaning where it had leaned for 4 nights. He asked whether they were finished. Cashin said probably, and sat down on the frozen mud beside the stool, which surprised both of them. Oren said he had asked once, on the road, whether they were buying rather a lot. Cashin said yes, he had. Oren said he would ask twice next time if that was permitted. And Cashin Vale, sitting in frozen mud having lost 13 gold, said that it was not permitted, it was required, and that he would put it in writing. It was the most valuable thing he bought that entire month, and it cost him nothing at all. Then he sat in the cold and made himself say the whole thing plainly, in order, the way he would have written it up for a committee. 1, he had been given a range and had traded the best number in it. 2, he had been told plainly that a downside existed which the system could not see, and he had not reduced by a single bale. 3, he had made it unsafe for the one man on his payroll with 11 years of road sense to ask him a second question. And 4, he had spent 9 days congratulating himself on being the only person in the province who could read a market, while a man in a charcoal coat, who could not read a market at all, simply knew somebody who had been in the room. That was the actual lesson, and it was worth more than 13 gold, which is fortunate, because 13 gold was what it cost. Information beats analysis. Every time. He had known that on Earth and had let a system make him lazy about it in 6 weeks. At the table the next morning he laid out what they had, which was 6 gold 40, a full warehouse of unsellable fodder and 2 days. Merritt said they should go to the guild and ask for terms. Cashin said the guild would not give terms because the guild had engineered the position. They would come on the 30th day and offer exactly what Ledwin had offered before, and this time it would be charity rather than a deal. Unless, in 2 days, he could find one person in the world who wanted 400 bales of winter fodder. He had spent the entire week asking the panel what his fodder was worth, and getting the same miserable answer in 3 different phrasings, which meant, he realized somewhere around the 3rd hour, that he had been asking the panel the wrong question for 9 consecutive days. Not what is this worth? He had learned that one already in a cold warehouse 6 weeks and 1 lifetime ago. Not where is this worth more either. He had walked 41 kilometers of that question, and it had brought him here. The question was who needs this, and does not yet know it. And there was one line in that panel he had read 6 times in 6 weeks and never once used, because he had never been desperate enough to be curious. Once per day it said, "What is this really worth?" He went out to the warehouse at first light on the 29th day and stood in front of 400 bales he could not sell. For 6 weeks he had asked the panel what things were worth, and where they were worth more, and it had made him a great deal of money and then taken it back. There was one line in it he had never used, because using it costs a day, and he had never had a day to spare. Once per day, what is this really worth? The panel did not tell him what it was worth. It told him what it was going to be worth and when. 7 silver, 38 days. Overwintering stocks fail in late winter, not early. It was such a stupid, obvious agricultural fact that he laughed out loud in an empty building. Nobody buys hay in December. Everybody buys hay in March, when the barn is empty and the grass has not come, and the cattle are still alive and still eating. He had not bought the wrong commodity. He had bought the right one at the wrong end of the season and then panicked at the bottom of it, which changed the entire shape of the problem, and it took him about 4 seconds to see how. He came into the kitchen and said they were not bankrupt. Merritt, who had been awake since 3 doing the same arithmetic, said that they were. And Cashin said no. He said they were solvent and they were a liquid and that those are not remotely the same thing. The Vale family owned assets worth more than the Vale family owed. That is solvent, and it is the only definition that matters. What they did not own was 18 gold in coin, on a Thursday, in a house on the wrong side of the river. That is a liquid, and it kills more businesses than bad ideas do, because it kills the good ones as efficiently as the stupid ones. Merritt asked what the difference bought them. He said it bought them the right to go looking for money instead of a buyer. A buyer for 400 bales of December hay does not exist in this province. He had spent 9 days proving it. But a lender against 400 bales that will be worth 7 silver in 5 weeks is a completely different animal. And that animal was standing in the valley he had spent a fortnight walking. Merritt said no farmer in 3 valleys had 18 gold. Cashin said that was correct and entirely beside the point. He did not need one person with 18 gold. He needed 30 people with 12 silver, and he had bought hay from most of them. He wrote the terms out at the table in 11 minutes. And they were the most important 11 minutes of that winter. 12 silver now, 18 silver back in 6 weeks, or 4 bales of hay in March, whichever the lender preferred. The hay was the security, and the hay was also the alternative payment, which meant nobody could lose except him. Merritt read it twice and said it was very generous. Cashin said it had to be because he was asking farmers to trust a boy who had just lost 13 gold in public. There was 1 day and a half left, 3 valleys, and a boy who could not read but knew every lane in all of them. They split the valley between them and walked it until dark. He started at the Bram Mill, because if Hesta said no, there was no point walking any further. He did not soften it. He said he had lost 13 gold, that it was his own fault, and that he needed 12 silver from her by tomorrow evening. Hesta Bram looked at him for the length of time it takes a mill wheel to go round twice, which is a very long time when somebody is doing it to you. Then she asked him one question, which was whether the hay was dry. He said it was, and that she was welcome to walk in and put her arm into any bale in the building. She said she would do exactly that tomorrow, and that if it was dry he would have his 12 silver and she would take the hay rather than the coin, because she had 300 sheep on the hill and knew exactly what her barn would look like in March. She had not needed the panel to tell her that. She had needed 61 years and she had them. After that it was arithmetic and boots. 9 farms said yes before noon. 4 said no politely. 2 said no in a way that suggested they had heard about the 13 gold. Pell did the upper valley and came back at dusk with 11 names, 4 of which were people Cashin had never met. He had not been able to read the terms, so he had memorized them and recited them at 11 kitchen doors without a single mistake. Cashin asked him how. Pell said it was only 12 and 18 and 4, and that fish had been harder. And on the last morning, he walked out to the drover's rest, which he had been avoiding for 2 days. Garrow Venn had paid him 121 silver on his return from Westfall without being asked twice, and had said nothing about it since. Cashin told him the whole thing, including the part where he had been outmaneuvered by a man in a charcoal coat. Garrow said he had wondered why a boy that sharp had never once tried to cheat him. Then he went into the inn and came back out with 4 gold, which was almost certainly everything he had. Cashin tried to explain the terms. Garrow said he did not want the terms, he wanted the hay in March at 4 bales of gold. He said his brother-in-law had 11 cows and a barn that would be empty by the thaw, and that this was the first winter he had ever been early for anything. They counted it in the yard on the evening of the 29th day, out of a bucket, because there was no bag large enough. 12 silver from Hesta Bram, 4 gold from a carter. 12 silver and 12 and 12, 31 times over. Merritt counted it 3 times, because the first 2 times she did not believe it. 18 gold and 40 silver, against a debt of 18 gold exactly due at noon. Orin asked whether they should count it a 4th time. Cashin said no, and then counted it a 4th time. And then he did the only thing left, which was to sit in a cold yard for 11 hours waiting for a man in a charcoal coat. Ledwin Ash came at 11 in the morning on the 30th day, an hour early with 2 men and a cart. The cart is the detail worth keeping. He had brought a cart, on the assumption that by noon the building would be his and there would be things to move. He was pleasant about it. He was always pleasant. He said he was sorry it had come to this, and he very nearly sounded it. He said the guild's offer of the previous week no longer stood, which was a lie so small and so mean that Cashin almost admired it. The debt was 18 gold, payable at noon, and the security was the warehouse, the yard, and the house. Cashin asked him to read out the clause about how payment was to be tendered. Ledwin, who had read that document more times than anybody alive, read it out without looking at it. Then Cashin opened the box at his feet. There is a particular thing a face does when it has planned for one outcome and been handed the other. And Ledwin Ash's face did all of it in about a second and a half. Then he put it all back, which was the most impressive thing Cashin ever saw him do. Merritt counted it out onto the crate in front of him, coin by coin in her own hand, because she had earned that and Cashin did not argue. 18 gold, on a crate in a frozen yard 40 minutes before noon. Ledwin signed the discharge standing up, using the leather case as a desk, and did not offer his hand afterwards. Merritt took the discharge, folded it twice, and put it inside her dress, and did not take it out again for 11 years. Then Cashin asked him to stay for a moment, because there was a piece of business he wanted to do. He said he understood what the building was for. Ledwin said he was sure he did not. So Cashin told him 41 kilometers to Ostwick, 3 days by cart, and no other roofed dry storage of any size between the river and the hills. A guild that has lost a supply contract because it could not move goods north fast enough does not need a warehouse in a town. It needs one on the road. Ledwin said nothing at all, which after 4 weeks of unfailing pleasantness was the loudest thing he had ever done. So Cashin offered to rent him half of it. 60 square meters, dry on the North Road at 4 gold a month, payable monthly in advance. He said the guild could take it, or it could spend a year and 40 gold building something on a road it did not own the land beside. And then, because he had learned exactly one thing in a cold yard with an ox, he stopped talking. Ledwin Ash stood in a yard he had come to repossess and negotiated a lease in it for 19 minutes. He got it to 3 gold 10 a month, which was a good result for him and an extraordinary one for a family that had owned nothing at breakfast. At the gate he stopped and said that Cashin had been very fortunate. And Cashin, who had lost 13 gold in 9 days and been rescued by 31 farmers and a carter, said that yes, he had. It was the only completely true sentence either of them said that morning, and it was the one that unsettled Ledwin most. The cart he had brought to empty the warehouse left the yard carrying nothing, which is a detail Pell told in Brackmore for the next 30 years. They ate at the table that evening, all 4 of them, which had not happened before and happened almost every week afterwards. Merritt had the ledger open beside her plate, because she was not going to stop now. The position, when she finished it, read as follows: 40 silver in coin, no guild debt at all, 27 gold owed to 31 farmers, a miller and a carter, 400 bales of hay worth 28 gold in March, and one line at the bottom that had changed for the first time since the panel opened. Reputation, unknown it had said for 6 weeks. It did not say unknown anymore. Local, trusted. He put the cup down and did not say anything for a while, and Merritt pretended not to notice. He had spent 6 weeks believing his advantage was the panel. The panel had not saved the house. 31 people who had been paid a little over the odds and told the truth had saved the house. And that, as it turned out, was the actual lesson of the whole 30 days. Later that night he walked the warehouse alone with a lantern, the way he had on the first day, when it had been almost empty and worth nothing. 400 bales of a commodity that everybody in the province had decided was worthless, in the only dry building on the North Road. The guild would move goods through half of it from the first of the month, at 3 gold 10, and would see everything he stored, which cut both ways, and he had already worked out which way it cut harder. Because a tenant who ships through your building tells you, every single week, exactly what he is shipping and where it is going. He had lost 13 gold because a man in a charcoal coat knew things first. In 11 days, that man would be storing his information in Cashin's building. It was, on any honest reading, the single best asset the Vale family owned, and it did not appear anywhere in the ledger. The panel gave him 3 levels and 1 letter, and told him plainly that the letter granted him nothing at all. Rank E, trader, which is 1 letter above nothing, and he had needed 30 days, a dead father's bad decision, and 31 farmers to get it. On Earth, Adrian Cole had been 3 levels from the top of an industry, and had owned none of it. Rank E, in a cold building with 40 silver and 400 bales and a debt to a Vale, was worth more than all of it. Because it was his. In the morning he called Oren into the yard and told him they were going to need more carts. Oren asked how many. Cashin said he did not know yet and that Oren should tell him because Oren knew carts and he did not. It was the second time in a week that his employer had told him to think out loud, and he was beginning to find it unnerving. Pell asked whether he still had a job, now that the debt was gone. Cashin said he had a job for as long as he wanted one, and then said the other thing, which he had been thinking about for 4 days. He said Pell was going to learn to read, an hour every evening, and that Merritt would teach him, and that he would be paid for the hour. Pell asked why. Cashin said because a man who can memorize 11 contracts and cannot read one is a waste of something, and he did not intend to waste anything else that winter. In 4 years, that boy would run a branch office in Westfall with 60 people in it, and would still be unable to spell his own surname correctly. The 30 days were over. The house was theirs, the warehouse was theirs, and the family owed 27 gold to people who had lent it out of nothing but an opinion of him, which is the only kind of debt worth having, and the only one he ever afterwards took seriously. The thaw came to Brackmore in the 2nd week of March, 3 days later than usual, which was the only piece of luck anybody had that year. 3 days is nothing, unless you are a cow and it is the 3rd week of an empty barn, in which case 3 days is everything you have. By the 10th of March, every hay barn in 3 valleys was a rectangle of dust and mouse droppings, and everybody who owned one knew exactly what that meant. The Vale warehouse held 400 bales of dry hay, and on the 11th of March it stopped being a mistake. They did not have to sell it, that was the entire point. Somebody came up the lane on the 11th and asked, then 2 more on the 12th, then 11 on the 13th, and Merritt had to start writing names on a board. The price went from 7 silver to 9, and Cashin held it at 7 for everybody who had lent him money in December. Merritt said that was 200 silver he was giving away. He said it was 200 silver he was buying something with, and did not explain further. Hesta Bram took her 12 silver in hay, as agreed, and then bought 30 bales more at the 7 price and made him take the money. She said she was not a charity, and neither was he, and that he should stop looking so pleased about being trusted. By the 21st of March, the last bale was gone and Merritt closed the winter ledger, which took her 4 hours and produced one number. 31 gold 40 from the hay, 27 gold back to the valley, 4 gold 40 left and a lease. 4 gold 40 for 13 weeks in which he had been evicted, given a system, made a fortune, lost it, and nearly lost a house that was not his. Merritt said it was 4 gold 40 more than they had started with. Cashin said that was true, and that it was also entirely the wrong number to be looking at. The right number was that in 13 weeks he had gone from a man nobody would lend a copper to a man 31 people had handed money to on his word. You cannot put that in a ledger. It does not stop it from being the most valuable thing in the building. On the 2nd of April, Cashin Vale walked into the Ashford Trade Guild Hall and applied to be registered as a trading house. He had thought about it for 11 days, mostly about whether to do it at all. Registration meant fees, records, inspections, and a guild that already disliked him knowing precisely what he moved and when. Staying unregistered meant staying small, staying local, and never once being able to enforce a contract in front of anybody who mattered. He had learned in a stone room at Ostwick what happens to a man who has a good position and no standing to act on it. Ledwin Ash took the application himself, which surprised nobody, and processed it correctly, which surprised everybody. He did not obstruct it, he did not slow it. He read every line, found nothing wrong, and stamped it in 11 minutes, which told Cashin something useful, which is that the man was not petty. He was something considerably more dangerous, which is patient. At the end he asked what name the house was to be registered under, with his pen already down on the line. Cashin had not thought about it once in 11 days, which is a strange gap in a man who thought about everything. Merritt said Vale and Company from the bench without being asked, in a voice that did not invite discussion, and Cashin, who had intended to say something clever, said nothing at all and let it stand. Vale and Company. Registered on the 2nd of April, capital 4 gold 40, employees 6, trade routes 1. It was, by any measure, available to the Ashford Trade Guild, the smallest registered house in the province. The first thing a registered house does is discover how much of what it has been doing was held together with string. Kell had 4 carts, 8 oxen, 6 men, and no system for any of it, and had been running the whole thing out of his head since January. Cashin asked him how he decided which cart went where. Oren said he just knew, which is the most expensive sentence in commerce. A business that runs out of one man's head is not a business. It is that man wearing a business as a coat. And Oren Kell, who could not read, was carrying the entire logistics of Vale and Company in a skull that had already been kicked by a horse once. The panel had a line he had never bothered to look at, because he had never owned 4 carts before. Utilization 38%, empty running 44%. Nearly half of every mile that Vale and Company traveled, it traveled carrying nothing at all. He had built an entire company on the observation that Garrow Ven's cart went to Westfall half empty, and had then done exactly the same thing for 4 months. So on the 4th of April, he called the first meeting Vale and Company ever held, which was 4 people at a kitchen table with a pot between them. He told them what the empty running number was, and that it was his fault, and that he had missed it for 4 months. Oren said, carefully, that he had thought it was odd they always went north loaded and came back light. Cashin asked how long he had thought that. Oren said since about the 2nd week of January, which was 11 weeks in which the only man who could see the problem had believed it was not his place to mention it twice. So he wrote a rule on a sheet of paper and pinned it to the kitchen wall, and it stayed there for 11 years. Anybody may say the obvious thing twice. Nobody is ever thanked for having thought it quietly. Then he gave Oren Kell the second half of the problem, which was that a cart going home empty is a cart looking for a customer. Oren said he could not write. Cashin said that was not what he had asked, and that Pell would write it down. Pell had been reading for 5 weeks, an hour a night, and could manage names, numbers, and about a third of everything else. So a carter who could not read dictated the first haulage schedule in the history of Vale and Company to a boy who could barely write it. It took them 4 hours. It was almost illegible, and it was worth more than everything else on that table. Merritt copied it into a ledger in her own hand, and then copied it again, and gave the second copy to Oren to keep in his coat. Oren, who could not read a word of it, carried that sheet for 9 years and produced it in 3 separate arguments, all of which he won. The schedule was simple, and it was not clever, and it took the empty running from 44% to 19% in 6 weeks. North with fodder and iron, south with wool and hides, east with salt. Nothing went anywhere with an empty bed unless somebody had signed a piece of paper explaining why. They doubled the capacity of the company without buying a single cart or a single ox, which is the least glamorous thing that happens in this entire story, and it made more money than the salt, the grain, and the hay put together. By the end of April, the warehouse was carrying 11 different commodities, and Merritt had run out of columns. She said she needed a second ledger for carriage alone. Cashin said she needed a second person, and she said she would think about it, which meant no. The Ashford Guild took possession of their half of the building on the 1st of May, exactly as agreed, and paid 3 gold 10 in advance. They built a partition down the middle, which Cashin paid for, and a separate door at the north end, which he also paid for and did not begrudge either, because a partition has 2 sides, and he had spent 4 gold to put the Ashford Trade Guild's entire northern operation within 30 feet of his own tally board. He did not spy on them. He did not need to. He counted their carts. Pell counted every cart that went through the north door, what it carried, which way it turned, and how long it stayed, and put it on a slate every evening. It was the single cheapest piece of market intelligence anybody in that province bought that year, and it cost 3 silver a week and a reading lesson. By the middle of May, the slate had told him 3 things that the guild had not told anybody. 1, Ashford was moving iron north in quantity, in April, which is not a season anybody builds in. 2, their carts were going north loaded and coming back loaded, which meant they had finally learned the thing Oren had known since January. And 3, what they were bringing back was not grain or wool or hides or anything a river province produces. It was stone. Black, heavy, unremarkable stone in reinforced crates from somewhere north of Ostwick at 11 crates a week. Merritt said the hills north of Ostwick were worthless, and everybody knew it. Nothing grew there, and nothing came out of them but bad weather. And Cashin said that this was the second time in 5 months that everybody had known something, and that the last time it had been worth 11 barrels of salt. So on the 19th of May, he sent Pell down to the north door to ask a carter, very politely, what was in the crates. The carter said it was ballast. Pell asked why anybody would pay to haul ballast 400 kilometers, and the carter told him to clear off. Which was, Cashin thought, a remarkably informative answer for a man who had refused to answer. Nobody guards ballast, nobody crates ballast, and nobody in the history of carriage has ever reinforced a crate to hold something worthless. There was one crate on the guild's side of the partition with a split board, which he had not arranged and did not need to. He did not go through the partition. He was a registered trading house now, and he had read what happens to registered houses that interfere with a tenant's goods. But a split board sheds, and what a split board sheds ends up on the floor, and the floor on his side of the partition belonged to him. He picked up a piece the size of a thumbnail. It was black, slightly warm, and heavier than it had any business being. He asked the panel what it was worth out of habit, and did not expect the answer to be interesting. 3 copper, no demand, no established trade, regarded locally as spoil. Which settled it. He put the piece in his coat pocket and went back to work and thought about it for 6 days. It was the 11 crates a week that would not leave him alone. The Ashford Trade Guild was many things, and Cashin had by then formed a fairly complete opinion of most of them. Sentimental was not on the list. They did not haul worthless rock 400 kilometers 11 crates at a time out of affection for it. So either the Ashford Trade Guild had lost its mind, or the panel had told him the truth, and the truth was not the whole of it. Market value is not worth. He had known that since the first morning, standing in a cold warehouse looking at 11 barrels of salt. Market value is what people are currently prepared to pay. Worth is what a thing can do, and nobody had ever asked this stone what it could do. On the 26th of May, in a dark kitchen, Cashin Vale used true value for the second time in his life. Current market value 3 copper. True value approximately 1,800 gold. He read it 4 times. The number did not change, and neither did the line underneath it, which was the part that mattered. Unknown refining application detected. Unknown, the system did not know what it was for. It only knew that somebody somewhere could do something with it that was worth 1,800 gold a ton, which meant the Ashford Trade Guild already knew what it was for, and had known for at least 11 weeks, and had told nobody. He sat in the dark for a long time and did not feel triumphant, which surprised him, and then he worked out why. In December, a man in a charcoal coat had known about a granary 2 weeks before he did, and it had cost him 13 gold and very nearly a house. Now the same guild knew about a mineral, and it was hauling 11 crates of it a week through a building he owned half of. The difference between December and May was not that he had got cleverer. It was that this time he was standing inside the information instead of outside it. At first light, he walked the length of the partition and looked at it properly for the first time. 60 square meters of dry storage on the North Road, leased to the Ashford Trade Guild at 3 gold 10 a month, for as long as they wanted it. He had thought, in a frozen yard in February, that he was selling them storage and buying their movements. He had been thinking too small. Again, it was becoming a habit and he intended to break it, because the guild was not renting storage from Vale and Company. The guild was routing an entire undisclosed industry through a building with a hole in the wall. He called the second meeting of Vale and Company that evening, and this one lasted until 2 in the morning. He told them everything except where the number came from, and he told them plainly that he could not tell them that part. Merritt said she had stopped asking where his numbers came from in January, and did not intend to start again in May. The plan they built that night had 4 parts, and 3 of them were entirely legal. 1, find out what the stone does. 2, find out where it comes from. 3, buy the ground it comes out of quietly before anybody explains it to the people standing on it. Oren asked what the 4th part was. Cashin said the 4th part was that they had 11 weeks at most, and probably fewer. Because a guild that hauls 11 crates a week in April is a guild that intends to haul 100 by autumn, and it does not do that without buying the hill first. They left for the northern hills on the 2nd of June with 2 carts, a written schedule, 4 gold 40, and a piece of rock the size of a thumbnail. It was, on any honest accounting, the least equipped expedition in the history of that province, and it went out looking for an industry that did not have a name yet. Past Ostwick, the farmland gives out over about 4 miles, and then there is nothing but hill. They followed the crates, which is a far better guide than a map, because a crate has to come from somewhere. Pell had been counting carts for 6 weeks and had every one of them on a slate, including which way they turned at the Ostwick Fork. They turned left every time onto a road that went to 11 villages and nowhere else at all. Of the 11, 10 had never sent anything anywhere. The 11th had a hole in the hill above it. Slagback, 11 houses, 41 people, 1 spring, and a spoil heap that had been growing since before anybody's grandfather. The mine had been worked for lead, badly, for about 90 years, and had given out in Cashin's grandfather's time. What it had produced in 90 years was a very small amount of lead and an enormous quantity of black rock that nobody wanted. Cashin stood at the bottom of it and did some arithmetic that made him feel briefly unwell. 1,800 gold a ton, refined. And there were, at a conservative guess, 40,000 tons of it lying on that hillside. He made himself stop calculating, because the number was meaningless until he knew what the stone did, and he still did not. The man who told him was Tam Auric, who was 58, and who had been the village smith for 40 of them. He did not tell him because Cashin was clever. He told him because Cashin asked him a question nobody had asked him in 40 years. He asked him what the black rock was good for. Tam Auric said it was good for nothing, in the flat way of a man who has answered that question before, and then he said the other thing. He said it made a poor hearth back because it would not hold the heat, and that his grandfather had lined the hearth with it and had had to take it out again. Cashin asked him to say that again, and Tam, who was not a man who repeated himself, looked at him properly for the first time. It would not hold the heat, not it did not hold heat well, it would not hold it at all. Tam picked a piece off the floor, put it in the hearth with tongs, left it a full minute in a fire hot enough to soften iron, and lifted it back out. The iron tongs came out orange, the stone came out black. Cashin put his hand out. Tam said not to. Cashin put his hand out anyway, and the stone was cool. Not warm, cool. It had been in a smith's fire for 60 seconds, and it was cooler than the air in the room. Tam said it did that. He said it had always done that. He said it was why it was no good for anything. For 40 years, a smith in a hill village had known that this rock eats heat, and had filed it under useless, because in a village nothing needs to be made cold. That is not stupidity, that is context. A thing is only worth something where somebody has the problem it solves. Pell asked who in the world has a problem with too much heat. Cashin said everybody who has ever built a furnace, and then he stopped talking for 11 minutes. He went out and sat on a wall above the village and made himself write it down properly. Because a thought that cannot survive being written down is not a thought. Every forge, every glasshouse, every foundry, and every mana furnace in the kingdom has exactly one permanent enemy, and it is not fuel. It is waste heat. You can always make a thing hotter. Making a specific part of it colder on purpose is the problem that has been eating engineers since somebody first built a wall around a fire. The panel confirmed the property and refused, politely, to tell him the application, which was the correct behavior, and he was almost pleased about it. A system that told him the answer would have made him an idiot inside a year. The property was the fact. The application was the business. And the Ashford Trade Guild had already found the application because they were hauling it 11 crates at a time. He asked Tam who owned the heap. It is, in the whole of this story, the single most important question anybody asks. Tam said the village did. He said it had come back to the common when the mine company folded, and that there had been a paper about it once in somebody's kitchen. A paper, once, in somebody's kitchen. Cashin asked very carefully whether anybody had come asking about that paper recently. Tam said a man in a good coat had come up in April and had asked about that exact paper twice, and had been very pleasant about it. Cashin stood on 40,000 tons of somebody else's future, and worked out that he had, at the outside, a fortnight. That evening he did the thing that decided what kind of company Vale and company was going to be, and he very nearly did it the other way. He had 4 gold 40 and a fortnight, and the village had a spoil heap they had spent 90 years treating as a nuisance. He could have bought it outright for perhaps 8 gold and a good lunch, and every single person in Slagback would have thanked him warmly for taking it away. And in 3 years they would have found out what it was worth, the way you always find out, which is from somebody else's prosperity. He knew exactly how that felt from the inside, because a fat man on a quayside had once sold him a curtain rail for 35 silver. Sal Bianchi had not cheated him. Sal Bianchi had simply known something and had been perfectly entitled to keep it, and Cashin had walked away and laughed about it for a week. The difference, he decided, sitting on a tailboard in a hill village, was that a compass is one object and a hillside is 41 people's entire ground. It was not a moral argument. He was very clear with himself about that then and afterwards. A man who buys a hill from people who do not know what it is has bought a hill, and 41 enemies who will find out. A man who tells them what it is, and offers them a share has bought 41 people who will keep a guild off it for him. Oren said that was a very generous way to describe being decent. Cashin said he would take that, and that it was cheaper than a lawsuit either way. So on the 4th of June, Cashin Vale stood in front of 31 adults of the village of Slagback and told them what was on their hillside. He told them all of it. What it did, that a guild was buying it already, roughly what it was worth, and that he did not yet know what it was for. Nobody believed him. This is worth saying plainly because it is what actually happens when you tell people the truth about their own ground. So Tam Oric, who had lived among them for 58 years, walked into his forge and came back out with a pair of tongs and a piece of rock. He did the demonstration 11 times for 11 different people and let every one of them put their hand under it. A number on a piece of paper convinces nobody. A cold stone out of a hot fire in your own hand convinces everybody. Then Cashin made them the offer, and it was not the offer any of them expected, including Oren. He did not offer to buy the heap. He offered to buy the right to shift it for 20 years at 1 silver in every 8 the stone ever earned. Paid every quarter to the village in coin, whether he made anything of it or not, with a floor of 40 gold a year. 40 gold a year was more money than the village of Slagback had seen in the whole of the previous decade. Tam Oric asked why he was not simply buying it, since they would plainly have sold. And Cashin told him the truth, which was that a guild with lawyers would take a purchase off him inside 2 years, and could not take a village share off 41 people at once. Tam Oric said that was the first useful thing a man from outside had said in that village in 40 years, and put his mark on the paper. 29 of the 31 signed that morning. The other 2 signed on the Thursday after they had walked to Ostwick and back to check he was a registered house, which was, Cashin thought, the single best thing that had come out of standing in a cold guild hall in April, and he had very nearly not bothered. They loaded both carts to the axles that afternoon with rock that had been lying on a hillside since before anybody's grandfather. Cashin shoveled for 4 hours badly and had blisters for a week, and it was the best money he never spent. Because 41 people watched a registered merchant with clean boots fill a cart with his own hands, and that was worth more than the contract was. They came down off the hill on the 6th of June with 11 tons of black rock and no earthly idea what to do with it. Pell asked who they were going to sell it to. Cashin said that was the correct question and that he had been avoiding it for 2 days. He had a property, a source, a contract, and a cart full of stone. What he did not have was a single customer anywhere in the world. The Ashford Trade Guild had one. That was the whole of their advantage, and it was an enormous one. So he did the thing he had learned in a stone room at Ostwick, and stopped trying to sell, and started asking where the heat problem actually lived. The panel gave him the answer in 6 lines, and the last one changed the entire shape of the next 2 years. There were 4 licensed mana furnaces in the kingdom. All 4 belonged to the crown. One of them was at the arsenal outside Ostwick, which meant the Ashford Trade Guild was not selling black rock to industry. There was no industry. There was one customer, and it was the government. And a guild that supplies a crown arsenal has not made a trade. It has made a relationship, and relationships do not have exclusivity clauses either. Oren asked why he had stopped in the middle of the road. Cashin said he was working out how to sell rocks to an army, and Oren said he would put the kettle on. It took them 3 days to get down to Ostwick, and Cashin spent all 3 of them writing a single document. Not a sales letter, a test protocol, because you do not sell an unknown material to a crown arsenal. You cannot. There is no procurement line for a thing that does not have a name. What you can do is offer them, at your own cost, a trial they have wanted for 11 years and have never had the budget line to run. Cashin Vale had written procurement documents for 19 years on another world, in a different language, for people who had ruined him. It was the first time since he died that the thing he was actually best at had been any use to him whatsoever. Pell asked him what a protocol was. Cashin said it was a way of making a very careful person say yes to something they are not allowed to buy. It had 4 parts. Vale and Company would supply the material free. Vale and Company would pay for the trial. Vale and Company would accept the arsenal's own measurements as final. And the 4th part, which was the only one that mattered, was that whatever the trial found would be published to the crown, in full, whether it was good or bad. because a guild that has been quietly supplying an arsenal for 11 weeks cannot possibly agree to that, and Cashin intended everybody to notice. The Ashford Trade Guild's cart reached Slagback on the 11th of June, 5 days after Vale and company left it. Tam Oric met them on the track with his arms folded and told them the heap was under contract. They asked to see it. He showed them. It was in order, it was registered, and it was signed by 31 people. One of them asked, reasonably, how much it would take to buy the contract out. Tam Oric said that was a matter for the village. And then he pointed at the doorways, where the village was already standing, all of it, without having been called. The guild cart left within the hour. It is the only time in this story that the Ashford Trade Guild was outmaneuvered by geography rather than by paper. Tam Oric went back into his forge and worked until dark, and told his wife that evening that he had rather enjoyed himself. Cashin did not know any of that for 9 days, and when he found out, he sat down on a step and put his head in his hands for a while. Not because it had worked, because he had spent 4 months believing that his advantage over the Ashford Trade Guild was information, and it was not. They had better information than he did. They had known about the granaries, and the stone, and the arsenal, and the paper in somebody's kitchen every single time first. What they did not have was 31 people who would stand in their own doorways for him without being asked. Capital 2 gold 10, which was less than he had started the month with. Trade routes 2. Mineral rights 20 years 1. And influence, whatever influence is, had gone from 31 to 94 in 9 days. He had 2 gold 10 and 11 tons of black rock, and a document nobody had read yet. On the 20th of June, he walked into the Crown Arsenal outside Ostwick and asked to speak to whoever was responsible for the furnace. It took him 11 days and 4 separate refusals to get in front of that person, and he treated every refusal as information. Refusal 1 told him the furnace answered to the Ordnance Office. Refusal 2 told him the Ordnance Office answered to a man in the capital. Refusal 3 told him the furnace had been over its fuel allocation for 4 consecutive quarters. Refusal 4 told him why. The furnace was shutting down for 11 days in every 40 to let the lining cool, and every one of those days was costing the Crown an enormous amount of money. 11 days in 40. 27% of the only mana furnace within 200 kilometers lost to a lining that could not shed heat fast enough. He had spent 11 days being refused by an institution that was, at that exact moment, losing a quarter of its capacity to the one problem he had 11 tons of. On the 2nd of July, the ordnance officer for the Northern Arsenal agreed to read a document, mostly to make a persistent young man go away. It offered him a free trial of an unnamed material, at no cost, measured by his own people, with the results published to the Crown whatever they said. There was no risk in it anywhere. That was the entire design of it, and it was the second time Cashin Vale had built that exact machine. The trial was set for the 9th of August, which gave the Ashford Trade Guild 5 weeks to find out about it. They found out in 9 days, which was 4 days faster than he had allowed for, and he adjusted his estimate of them accordingly. And on the 16th of July, a letter arrived at the Vale house in Brackmore, in a very good hand, inviting Cashin Vale to dine with the Ashford Trade Guild. The Ashford Trade Guild kept a private dining room in Ostwick that seated 18, and they sat 3 people in it on purpose. Cashin came in his working clothes, which was not defiance. He simply did not own anything else and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Eveline Ashford was 57 and had run the guild for 19 years, and Cashin had never once heard her name spoken in Brackmore. Ledwin Ash sat at her left hand and did not speak for the first 40 minutes, which told Cashin precisely where he ranked. She was courteous, she was well informed, and she did not waste a single sentence on the weather. She said she had read his registration, his lease, his Slagback contract, and his arsenal protocol, and complimented him on the last one specifically. Cashin understood that every one of those documents was public, and that she had told him so deliberately, and thanked her for the compliment. Then she made 3 offers, in ascending order, over about an hour, and the third one was very nearly good enough. 1, the guild would buy the Slagback rights outright for 200 gold, which was a serious number and a genuine offer. 200 gold was more money than the Vale family had ever had, by a factor of about 40. He said no and did not explain, because an explained refusal is a negotiation, and he was not there to negotiate. 2, the guild would take Vale and company into the guild as a chartered house, with the Slagback rights held jointly and the northern route protected. That one took him 9 seconds, which was 8 seconds longer than the first, and Iveline Ashford noticed the difference and said nothing. 3. The guild would leave Slagback entirely alone, in writing, in perpetuity, in exchange for the Arsenal Protocol being withdrawn before the 9th of August. And that was the offer that told Cashin everything he had come to find out. They were not frightened of losing a hillside. Hillsides can be bought. They were frightened of a published measurement, which meant the guild had been supplying that arsenal without anybody ever writing down what the material actually did. They were selling it as a refractory sand at 40 gold a ton, and it was worth 1,800, and the only thing protecting that gap was that nobody had measured it. He said no to that one as well, and then he did something he thought about for a long time afterwards. He told her why. He said the guild had built a 19-year business on the arithmetic of other people not knowing things, and that it was a good business and it was ending. Iveline Ashford put her glass down and looked at him for rather a long time, and then asked him a question that nobody had asked him since he died. She asked him where a 19-year-old from a bankrupt house on the wrong side of a river had learned to talk like a man closing out a position. Cashin said his father had taught him. It was the same lie he had told a carter in a cold yard in December, and it was getting thinner every time he used it. She let it stand, which was worse than challenging it, and said she looked forward very much to the 9th of August. The trial was 3 weeks away, and Cashin did not have the faintest idea how to prepare for it, so he went to the only man who did. Tam Auric had never seen a mana furnace, and said so immediately, which is the most useful sentence any expert can say. But he had lined 400 hearths in 40 years, and knew exactly what a lining has to survive, which turned out to be the entire problem. Loose rock is useless. A furnace lining has to be cut, bedded, keyed, and mortared, and it has to sit there for a year without moving. Cashin had 11 tons of loose spoil, and a document promising a crown arsenal a working trial in 3 weeks. Tam Auric said he could cut 400 blocks in 3 weeks with 6 men, and that he did not have 6 men, and that the village did. Slagback cut stone for 19 days. Everybody who could hold a chisel, including 4 people who could not, and 2 who were 11 years old. Pell counted and graded every block onto a slate, and by the end of it could tell a keyed edge from a bedded one at 9 feet. Cashin cut stone badly for 19 days and paid the village a silver a day each, which nobody had asked for and which cost him almost everything he had left. On the 8th of August, 2 carts came down out of the hills carrying 411 dress blocks, and Cashin had 2 gold and 10 silver left. Ren Doric met them at the gate, having transferred himself onto the trial roster by means nobody ever explained. He said the ordnance office had wanted a quartermaster present who knew the supplier. Cashin said that was very convenient. Doric said it was, wasn't it? The furnace house was the largest interior Cashin had ever stood in, and the only light in it came out of the seams of the furnace door. Tam Auric walked around it twice, put his hand flat on the outer casing at 4 separate points, and said the man who built it had never had to repair it. The lining was firebrick over rammed clay, and it was doing exactly what firebrick does, which is hold heat superbly, and then refuse to let go of it. 11 days in every 40, the whole thing sat dark, while a lining that had done its job too well slowly stopped doing it. The trial was simple, which is why Cashin had designed it that way. 1 test panel of the arsenal's own firebrick, 1 of Slagback stone, same furnace, same charge, same measurements. Measured by arsenal staff, recorded by arsenal clerks on arsenal instruments, with Cashin standing at the back of the room and touching nothing. He had learned that at 38, in a glass room, from a man who ruined him. If you want a result believed, never be the one holding the instrument. They fired it at 6 in the morning and ran it for 11 hours at full charge. Tam Auric watched the whole 11 hours without sitting down once, and told Cashin afterwards that it was the finest thing he had ever seen in his life. Pell was not allowed inside and stood at the door for 11 hours anyway, and wrote down every time anybody said a number out loud. At 5 in the evening, they shut the charging door and began measuring the 2 test panels every quarter of an hour. At the first measurement, the 2 panels were the same, and Cashin felt his stomach go and made himself keep his arms folded. At the second, half an hour in, they were still the same. At the third, at 1 hour, an arsenal clerk read out the 2 numbers, and then stopped and read the second one again. The firebrick panel was still hot enough to light a room, The Slagback panel was cool enough to put a hand on. Ren Doric, who was there to observe and had no business doing anything at all, put his bare hand flat on it in front of 11 witnesses. Cashin did not move from the wall. He had been standing in exactly that spot for 13 hours, and he stayed there until the last measurement was written down. The last measurement was taken at 4 in the morning, 9 hours after shutdown, and by then the arithmetic was not in any doubt. 11 days of cooling became 2. Furnace availability went from 72% to 95%. For the Crown, that was not a saving. It was 23% more capacity out of a furnace it already owned, in a year when it very badly wanted it. Tam Auric asked whether that meant they had won. Cashin said it meant they had proved something, and that proving a thing and owning it are separate activities. The measurement was published to the Crown on the 14th of August, in full, exactly as the protocol said it would be. 9 days later the letters began, and Merritt had to buy a second filing box, and then a third. 2 glasshouses, 4 foundries, a shipwright, the Ostwick forges collectively in 1 letter signed by all 14. And on the 29th of August, 1 letter that was not like the others, on paper that had been made in the capital. It was from the Ordnance Office of the Crown, and it did not contain an order. It contained an appointment. The Crown did not buy materials from unchartered houses. It bought them under warrant, and the warrant for Northern Ordnance Supply belonged to somebody. It had belonged to the Ashford Trade Guild for 19 years, and the guild held it from the man whose name was at the bottom of that letter. Merritt asked who Duke Adrian Cole was. Cashin said he did not know, and that this was, on the whole, the worst news in the letter. He had built 4 months of advantage out of knowing things first, and a man had just walked into his story whose name he had never heard. Duke Adrian Cole came to the arsenal on the 11th of September with 4 riders, and no ceremony whatsoever. He was 49, he had commanded on 2 frontiers, and he wore nothing that identified him as anything at all. He did not introduce himself. He asked Cashin to walk him through the trial from the beginning, and he asked 11 questions. Every one of them was about measurement, none of them was about money, and by the 4th Cashin had revised his estimate of the man upward twice. In the furnace house he put his own hand on the Slagback panel, and then he asked Tam Auric, not Cashin, how it would fail. Tam said it would fail at the joints in about 4 years, and that anybody who told him otherwise was selling him something. It was the first time in the entire day that Duke Adrian Cole looked pleased, and he did not look pleased again for 11 months. Outside in the yard, he told Cashin what the position actually was in 4 sentences without softening any of them. The Crown wanted the material. The Crown could not buy from an unchartered house. The warrant was held by the Ashford Trade Guild, and the guild had already applied that week to have Slagback stone added to their existing warrant as a schedule item, which would make Vale and Company a supplier to the Ashford Trade Guild, at whatever price the Ashford Trade Guild cared to name, for 20 years. Cashin asked him why he was explaining all this. Cole said because he had read the protocol and wanted to see what the man who wrote it would do about it. He said he had no interest in Cashin's prosperity, and none at all in the guilds, and that his furnace had been running at 72% for 4 years. And then he said the sentence that Cashin wrote down that night and kept for the rest of his life. He said a warrant is not a right. It is a convenience the Crown grants to whoever is least trouble, and it can be moved. Then he rode out of the yard with 4 men and did not look back, and Cashin stood in the dust for 11 minutes. The whole of Vale and Company met that night, all 6 of them now, in a kitchen that had stopped being a kitchen sometime in June. Cashin laid out the position honestly, including the part where they had 2 gold 10 and 400 letters they could not fill. Merritt said the obvious thing, which was that they should take the guild's charter offer, which was still open and now looked considerably better. And Cashin said yes, it did, and that this was exactly why Eveline Ashford had left it open, and that they were not going to take it. Because a warrant can be moved, and a man who commands 2 frontiers had just told him so in a dusty yard, on purpose for free. Orin asked what it would take to have a warrant moved. Cashin said he had absolutely no idea, and that finding out was now the entire business. They worked until 3 in the morning and produced a list of everything they did not know, which ran to 2 full pages. Cashin looked at those 2 pages for a long time and then said, out loud, that this was the first honest document the company had ever produced. Every disaster of the previous 9 months had come from a thing he had not known he did not know. This was the first time he had written the gaps down before walking into them. It hung on that wall next to the rule about saying the obvious thing twice. And between them, those two sheets are most of what Vale and Company ever actually was. Rank D, Merchant. Capital 2 gold 10, which was the same 2 gold 10 he had been carrying since June. 400 orders he could not fill, 1 mineral nobody could buy, and an influence figure that had gone up by a factor of 9 while his money had not moved at all. Which was, he thought, an extremely accurate description of a company that had built something valuable and did not yet have permission to sell it. Merritt, clearing the table at 4 in the morning, asked him what he was actually going to do, and Cashin said he was going to find out what the Ashford Trade Guild's warrant was actually worth to the man who granted it. Because a convenience granted to whoever is least trouble is not a right. It is a price, and Cashin Vale had spent 2 lifetimes learning what to do with a price. He spent September and October doing nothing that looked like anything at all, which is what the next part of this story is mostly about. He filled none of the 400 orders. He raised no money. He bought no stone, and he moved no stock, and he answered every letter with the same 4 polite lines. Vale and Company regrets that it is not presently able to supply. Vale and Company will write again when it is. Merritt told him twice that he was strangling the company. He said he was doing the opposite and asked her to keep writing the letters. Because 400 people who cannot get a thing they have measured and want, and who are told politely every month that they still cannot have it, do not go quiet. They write to somebody else. And by the end of October, 400 foundries, forges, glasshouses, and shipwrights had all written to exactly the same office. Not to Vale and Company, which had already told them no. To the Ordnance Office of the Crown, asking why a measured material was not available under warrant. Cashin had not asked any of them to do it. He had simply arranged, at some cost to himself, for it to be the only reasonable thing left for any of them to do. It cost the company 2 months of trading, its remaining capital, and very nearly Merritt, who did not speak to him for 9 days in October. She came back because she checked the arithmetic, and it was correct, and Merritt Vale had never in her life been able to argue with arithmetic that was correct. On the 9th of November, a writer came up from Ostwick with a letter on very fine pale paper and a hard black seal. The Ordnance Office of the Crown was reviewing the Northern Supply Warrant, as it did every 7 years, and the review had been brought forward. Interested parties were invited to submit. The hearing was set for the 4th of December in the capital, before the Ordnance Office and the holder of the warrant. Vale and Company had 2 gold 10, no stock, no orders filled since August, and 11 months of trading history in total. And it had, in its filing boxes, 411 letters from people who wanted a thing the Ashford Trade Guild had spent 19 years making sure nobody measured. They went south on the 22nd of November, and it was the first time in his life that Cashin Vale had left the province. Merritt came because Cashin asked her to, and because she had never in 52 years been further south than the Ostwick Fork. Pell came because he had spent 9 months counting things, and Cashin had worked out that this was going to be a hearing about counted things. The road south is metalled the whole way, has ditches on both sides, and carried more traffic in an hour than the North Road carried in a week. Cashin looked at the ditches for about 4 miles, and then said, out loud, that somebody had spent an enormous amount of money on drainage. Merritt said only he could look at a ditch and be impressed. He said a road is a promise about how much traffic somebody expects, and that this one was promising a great deal. They came into the capital on the 29th, in freezing fog, and none of the 3 of them said anything for about 11 minutes. Merritt Vale, who had run a merchant house's books for a year, and had never once been frightened by a number, was frightened by the number of people. Brackmore had 400 people. This street had 400 people on it, and it was not a large street, and it was Tuesday. Above the roofline stood the ordnance offices, which are 11 bays wide, 4 stories high, and entirely without a single decorative feature. They took a room for 4 nights that cost more than a month in Brackmore, and spent the first 3 of them working. Cashin had come to the capital with 411 letters, and absolutely no idea how a warrant hearing actually worked. So he did the thing that had worked in a market square 11 months earlier, and spent 2 days finding out what normal looked like. He sat in the public benches of 4 unrelated hearings, took notes at all of them, and learned more in 2 days than in the previous 2 months. What he learned was that nobody in that building cared about price, and that everybody in it cared about being blamed. An ordnance officer who buys cheaply and is later short of supply is finished. An officer who pays over the odds and is never short is promoted, which meant the Ashford Trade Guild's 19 years were not an obstacle. They were the entire case against him, and they were a very good one. 19 years of never once failing to deliver, against 11 months of trading, and a company that had refused 400 orders in a row. Merritt asked what their case was. Cashin said that was the correct question and that he had been avoiding it for 9 days. He could not argue reliability. He could not argue scale. He could not argue price because the guild would simply undercut him in the room and mean it. It was Pell who solved it at about 11 at night by asking why the guild had never told the arsenal what the stone did. Cashin said because it would have cost them the price gap. Pell said yes, but they were selling to the crown, and did that not make it different? And that was the case. A 13-year-old who could barely read had found it in one sentence, and Cashin had walked past it for 11 weeks. The guild had not cheated a customer. It had withheld a measurement from the crown for 11 weeks while holding a crown warrant, and those are not the same offense at all. They rebuilt the entire submission that night and finished at 4:30, and Merritt copied all of it in her own hand because it had to be legible. The hearing room in the ordnance offices is a cold, gray box with no fire in it, which everybody who has ever been in one remembers before anything else. The Ashford Trade Guild arrived with 4 people, 3 document boxes, and a clerk who did nothing but hand things forward. Vale and Company arrived with 3 people, 4 filing boxes of letters, and a 13-year-old holding a satchel of slates. Duke Adrian Cole sat in the middle of the bench and did not acknowledge Cashin in any way whatsoever. Evelyn Ashford went first because the holder always goes first, and she was extremely good. 19 years, 411 consecutive deliveries. Not one failure, not one shortfall, not one late consignment in the entire period. She had brought the delivery record, and it was genuine, and it was the most impressive document anybody produced in that room all day. Cashin sat and listened to it and did not take a single note, because there was nothing in it he intended to dispute. She finished by observing that the applicant had traded for 11 months and had declined 411 orders, and she was entitled to say it. Merritt beside him went white. Cashin wrote 3 words on a scrap and pushed it in front of her, and she read them and stopped shaking. The scrap said, "She is arguing our case." Cashin stood up when he was called and did not go anywhere near reliability, price, scale, or any of the 400 letters in his boxes. He asked the bench one question, which was whether the ordnance office had, at any point in the previous 4 years, been told what Slagback stone did. There was a pause of about 4 seconds, which in a hearing room is an extremely long time. Then Duke Adrian Cole put down the paper he had been reading for an hour and looked up for the first time. Cashin said he was not alleging anything. He said the Arsenal's own trial record was on the bench and that it was dated the 9th of August and that he would leave it there. The bench asked the guild directly. It is the only question anybody asked the Ashford Trade Guild that day, and it was 4 words long. Did the guild know? Evelyn Ashford had run a guild for 19 years, and had not got there by lying to a crown officer in a hearing room with a clerk writing. She said yes. Ledwin Ash closed the leather case on the table in front of him very quietly, and did not open it again. The bench sat for 11 minutes in complete silence while the clerk wrote, and nobody in that room said a word. Cashin sat with his hands folded and understood, with absolute clarity, that he had just won and that winning was going to be the smaller half of the problem. The bench did not strip the warrant. Cashin had known they would not, and had built the entire submission on the assumption that they would not. Stripping a 19-year warrant means admitting the ordnance office had been asleep for 19 years, and no institution has ever done that voluntarily. What they did instead was schedule the material separately, which is the single most bureaucratic act in this entire story, and it changed everything. The Ashford Trade Guild kept the Northern Ordnance warrant for everything it had ever supplied under it. Slagback stone was removed from the schedule of that warrant and placed on a schedule of its own to be tendered separately, with the measurement published. Vale and Company did not receive a warrant that day. It received the right to bid for one against anybody on a published measurement it had produced itself. Merritt asked him afterwards whether that was good. He said it was the best possible outcome and considerably worse than winning, and that she would see why by spring. Evelyn Ashford stopped at his table on the way out, which nobody expected, least of all Ledwin Ash. She said the boy had found the one line of attack that did not require him to be bigger than her, and that it had taken her 19 years to build the weakness he had used. Cashin said he had not found it. A 13-year-old had found it at 11 o'clock at night in a rented room, and he had spent 11 weeks walking past it. Eveline Ashford looked at the boy sitting at the end of the table with a satchel of slates, and then she said the thing that Cashin remembered for the rest of his life. She said that in 19 years, she had never once been beaten by somebody who could not afford to lose, and that she should have expected it to happen exactly like this. Then she told him that the tender would open in March, that she would be bidding, and that he should not mistake any of this for the end of anything. They walked out of the ordnance offices at 4 in the afternoon into a freezing fog, and none of them had anywhere at all to be. Merritt said she wanted to see the river, which she had never done, and which nobody had thought to suggest in 4 days. Pell counted the barges. He had counted 411 carts through a warehouse door, and he was not going to stop now. Cashin stood at the parapet and did the only arithmetic that mattered, which was that Vale and Company had one gold 40 and a tender in March. To bid in March, he needed cut stone, carriage, and the capital to hold a stockpile for 4 months without selling any of it. He had none of those things, and 11 weeks, and a competitor who had just been told in public exactly what he intended to do. Merritt asked him what he was thinking. He said he was thinking that he had spent 11 months learning to be right, and had learned almost nothing about being large. That night, in a rented room that cost more than a month in Brackmore, he opened the panel and asked it a question he had never asked it before. Not what is this worth, not where, not who needs it. He asked it what Vale and Company was actually short of. The answer was one word, and it was not the word he expected. Not capital, not demand, not carriage. Labor. Vale and Company could cut 400 blocks a month, and the tender would need 4,000. 41 people in a hill village, cutting stone by hand with chisels, in a valley where nobody had ever needed more than 400 of anything. He had spent a year solving problems by asking better questions. This was the first one that could not be solved by knowing anything at all. It could only be solved by hiring 400 people, and Vale and Company had one gold 40. They went north on the 8th of December, and it took 6 days, and Cashin did not say a great deal on any of them. Somewhere around the 4th day, he stopped trying to solve it as a problem of money, and started treating it as a problem of geography, which is what he was actually good at. There were not 400 spare pairs of hands in the northern hills. There were not 40. That was simply a fact about that country, and no amount of money would change it by March. But there were 400 spare pairs of hands in Brackmore every winter, because Brackmore is a river town, and the river work stops in December. Merritt asked what had happened to his face. He said he had been trying to move 400 people to a hillside for 9 days, and that he should have been moving the hillside. Slagback did not need to cut the stone. Slagback needed to dig it and put it on a cart, and Brackmore could do everything after that, which meant a cutting yard on the Vale side of the river, 40 men from the winter idle, and a warehouse he already owned half of. Pell asked how they were going to pay 40 men. Cashin said he had absolutely no idea, and that it was the second best problem he had ever had. The answer, when he found it in January, was the same answer as the hay and the advance and the loan from the valley, which is that he had been asking the wrong people for money all year. He did not borrow it. He sold 4 months of cutting capacity in advance at a discount to the 11 foundries who had been writing to him since August. Every one of them said yes inside 11 days, and 4 of them sent more than he had asked for, and 1 sent a note saying he had assumed the company was dead. 240 gold from people he had refused to serve for 4 consecutive months, on the strength of a measurement taken by somebody else, which is the entire argument for having refused them, and Merritt never fully forgave him for being right about it. The cutting yard opened on the Vale side of the river on the 11th of January, with 31 men and 9 women out of the winter idle, at a silver a day. Tam Oric came down from Slagback for 6 weeks to teach them, and complained continuously, and was visibly the happiest he had ever been. By the end of February, the yard was cutting 460 blocks a week, and Vale and Company had a stockpile it could not sell to anybody. That was, of course, the entire point. The tender opened on the 4th of March and required delivery of 4,000 blocks within 90 days of award. The Ashford Trade Guild bid, and bid well, and had carriage, capital, and 19 years of standing that Vale and Company did not have. What it did not have on the 4th of March was 4,000 cut blocks already stacked in a yard on a river, with a road running north out of it. Cashin had not outbid them. He had made delivery the only question that mattered, and had answered it 4 months before anybody asked. The award was published on the 19th of April, and Merritt read it out loud in a kitchen to 6 people, and had to stop twice. Rank C Master Merchant, capital 312 gold, employees 71. 14 months earlier, the same line had read employees 0, and he had looked at it for longer than he meant to in a frozen yard. He did not feel triumphant. He had been braced for it, and it did not come, and he spent some time that evening working out why. The answer was that he had won a tender for a material, and that Eveline Ashford had been right, and that this was not the end of anything at all. Because a crown schedule is a document, and documents get reviewed, and in 7 years somebody would stand in that cold room and argue that Vale and company had been asleep. And because the thing that had actually saved him, twice now, was not the panel and not the measurement. It was 31 farmers in December, and 41 villagers standing in their own doorways in June, and 11 foundries who sent money to a company they thought was dead, none of which appears anywhere in a merchant profile, and all of which Cashin Vale had spent 14 months slowly working out how to buy. In May, the first crown consignment went south under Vale and company carriage. 400 blocks on 11 carts, and Adrian Cole drove the lead animal himself. He had been out of work for a winter 14 months earlier, and he now had 11 carts, 31 animals, and 9 men reporting to him. Pell was 14 by then, could read anything put in front of him, and had begun quietly correcting Merritt's arithmetic, which she pretended to find irritating. And in Slagback, 41 people received 1 silver in every 8 the stone earned, every quarter in coin, exactly as written. Tam Oric used his share to rebuild the forge roof, and then bought a second anvil that he did not need and would not explain. And on the 9th of June, 15 months after a lock was changed on a door he did not own, Cashin Vale received a letter he had not expected at all. It was not from the guild, or the crown, or a foundry, or anybody in the northern province at all. It had come 400 kilometers from the coast, from a port he had never visited, about a harbor that had been silting up for 30 years. And it asked, in 4 careful paragraphs, whether Vale and company had any interest in a dead city. The letter came from a woman called Hesta Bram, which is not the Hesta Bram of the mill, and Cashin spent about 4 minutes being extremely confused about that. It was her sister. She had married out of the valley 30 years earlier, gone to the coast, and had been the harbor clerk at Kestrel Mouth for 19 of them. Hesta had told her sister about the boy who paid over the odds and told the truth, at some point in March, in a letter about something else entirely. Merritt said that a year of careful commerce had just been outperformed by 2 sisters gossiping about him in the post. The letter said Kestrel Mouth was dying, that the corporation had 600 gold of debt and 1,100 people left, and that they would sell anything to anybody. Oren asked why a port would be dying, since ports do not generally move. Cashin said that was exactly the right question and that he did not have the answer. So he went to look, because he had learned in a market square that you cannot price a thing you have not stood next to. He saw the problem from 4 miles away, from the top of the hills, before he had spoken to a single person. The bay was the wrong color. It should have been slate all the way out. It was brown and green in enormous curving shapes, and the shapes were sandbanks. Pell asked whether it had always been like that. Cashin said no, because there was a city there, and nobody builds a city of that size beside a puddle. Kestrel Mouth had been built for 11,000 people. There were 1,100 left, and they were living in about a third of it. It is a particular kind of quiet, a city with too few people in it. Not peaceful. Wrong in a way that takes about an hour to identify. The buildings were good. That was the first thing he noticed, and it never stopped bothering him. Dressed stone, slate roofs, proper cellars built by people who expected to stay. The warehouses on the quay were enormous, and 11 of them stood entirely empty with their doors open, which nobody bothers to close on a building nobody wants. And the harbor wall was the finest piece of engineering Cashin had seen in either of his lives. 1/2 kilometer of dressed stone, 2 carts wide, built 200 years earlier by people who had no machines and a great deal of confidence. It was in perfect condition. It had been maintained for 2 centuries and abandoned for 30 years, and it had not moved a finger's width. And it was protecting a harbor with no water in it. Cashin sat down on the wall with his legs over the seaward side and looked at the sandbanks for 2 hours, and Pell counted boats. There were 41 boats. 31 of them had not been in the water for years and were being used as sheds. He asked the panel what the harbor was worth, and it told him. And the number was so bad that he laughed out loud on an empty sea wall. Market value 0, not low, 0. The corporation would have given it to him and thanked him for the removal. 4/10 of a meter at low water. A trading vessel needs 4. The bay had lost 90% of its depth, and nobody had done anything about it for 30 years. The harbor clerk met them in the old counting house, which had 200 pigeonholes in it and nothing in any of them. She was 64. She had the same pale blue eyes as her sister, and she had kept the harbor books for 19 years after there was nothing left to write in them. She had a complete record of every vessel that had entered that harbor since the year 17, and Cashin very nearly forgot to breathe when she put it on the counter. 30 years of data on a dead harbor, kept by hand, by one person, for no reason at all except that it was her job. They read for 2 days. Pell read the tonnages and Cashin read the dates, and on the second afternoon they found the year it went wrong. Traffic did not decline. That was the thing. It did not taper off over 30 years the way a dying port should. It fell off a cliff in the year 26, from 400 vessels to about 90 in 11 months. He asked Hesta's sister what happened in the year 26. She said the river changed, and said it as though everybody knew, which in Kestrel mouth everybody did. 200 kilometers inland. In a year nobody at the coast remembers for any other reason. Somebody had straightened a river. Cut off 11 meanders on the lower Kell to drain a marsh and gain 4,000 acres of grazing, which it did, and which everybody involved was extremely pleased about. A straightened river runs faster. A faster river carries more silt, and every grain of it has to stop somewhere, and it stopped in Kestrel mouth. Nobody did anything wrong. Nobody was even careless. 4,000 acres of grazing 200 kilometers away killed a city of 11,000 people over 30 years. He walked the whole city that evening, and it took him 4 hours, and by the end of it he had stopped thinking about whether to buy it. The question was never whether a dead port was cheap. It was whether the thing that killed it was still happening. So he went back to the ledgers at 9 at night with a lamp and asked the only question that mattered, which was whether the bay was still filling up. Hesta's sister had recorded the depth at the harbor mouth every month for 19 years, because it was on the form and nobody had told her to stop. Cashin plotted 19 years of a number nobody had ever looked at, on a sheet of paper, at a counter in a dead building, at 2 in the morning. It fell hard for 11 years, then it slowed, and for the last 6 years it had not moved at all. The bay had finished silting. It had reached its new equilibrium 6 years earlier, and nobody in Kestrel mouth had noticed, because nobody plots a number they have given up on. Which changes everything, because dredging a harbor that is still filling is throwing money into water. Dredging a harbor that has stopped is a capital cost with an end date. In the morning he walked the wall again and did the arithmetic properly, and it was not good. 410,000 tons of silt, 22,000 gold, 6 to 9 years. Vale and Company had 312 gold. He was short by a factor of 70, and the time scale was longer than he had been alive in this world by a factor of 6. He sat down on the wall and made himself write the honest sentence, which was that he could not do this and would not be able to for a very long time. Pell asked whether that meant they were going home. Cashin said yes, and then sat there for another 40 minutes without moving, because there was something wrong with the arithmetic, and it took him most of that 40 minutes to find it. He had been pricing the dredging as a cost, and a cost is a thing you pay to get something, but 400,000 tons of anything is not a cost, it is a quantity. And Cashin Vale had spent 2 lifetimes learning that a quantity is never worth nothing. It is only ever worth nothing here. He got down onto the mud with his boots in it, and picked up a double handful of the thing that had killed a city. It was not sand. Sand is what comes off a coast. This had come 200 kilometers down a river out of upland farmland, and it was topsoil. 410,000 tons of the finest agricultural soil in the province, drained off 4,000 acres of upland and deposited, free of charge, at a seaport. He stood in the mud with his hands full of it and laughed until he had to sit down, which is not a dignified thing to do on a tidal flat. Pell, who had come down onto the mud after him and was extremely worried, asked whether he was all right, and Cashin said that they had been standing on the most valuable thing in the province for 2 days, and had described it in the ledger as an obstacle. It took him 3 days to build the model, And the model is the reason there is a city there now. You do not dredge a harbor. You sell 400,000 tons of topsoil to the farmers of a province whose upland has been washing away for 30 years. The dredging is not the cost. The dredging is the extraction. The customers pay for the removal and thank you for it, and the harbor gets deeper as a byproduct. He checked it 11 times looking for the flaw, because a thing that good is usually a badly worded question, and he had learned that in a betting shop that did not exist in this world. The flaw was real, and he found it on the fourth pass, and it was carriage. 200 kilometers of it uphill on a road that did not exist, which is where it would have died, except that Cash and Vale had spent 14 months building a haulage company and had 4 carts standing idle every winter. He put it to the whole company in the kitchen at Brackmore on the 4th of August, and it went considerably worse than he had expected. Merritt said no, not that it was risky. She said no flatly for the first time in 15 months and gave 3 reasons, and every one of them was correct. The company had a crown schedule to deliver on for 2 more years. It had 71 people whose wages depended on that schedule, and it had 300 gold. Oren said the carriage alone would break the haulage side inside a year, and he said it twice, because there was a sheet of paper on the wall telling him to. Cashin listened to all of it, agreed with every word, and then said that he was going to do it anyway and that they should hear why before deciding what they thought. He said that everything Vale and Company owned sat on one crown schedule, and that a schedule is a document, and that documents get reviewed every 7 years by cold rooms full of tired men. He said he had built a company whose entire existence depended on the continued goodwill of an institution that had already shown it would move a warrant when it suited, and that a harbor is not a document. A harbor is a hole in a coast that ships either can or cannot enter, and no cold room anywhere can vote on the depth of the water. Merritt asked him whether this was about ownership. He said yes, and did not qualify it, and it was the most honest thing he ever said in that kitchen. He had died on a concrete step at 38, understanding money better than almost anybody alive and owning none of it. And he had never once told anybody in this world about that. Merritt Vale, who had never heard of Adrian Cole and never would, looked at her nephew for a long moment, and then asked what the first year would cost. Which is not agreement. It is the specific sound a person makes when they have decided to be persuaded and want to be talked into it properly. They argued about it for 9 days, and the plan that came out at the end of it was not his plan, and was better. Oren's version moved silt only in the 4 dead months when the crown carriage stopped, which halved the volume and removed the entire objection. Merritt's version refused to buy the city at all in the first year, and took a 20-year lease on the harbor instead, at a rent the corporation could not refuse. Cashin said that was better than anything he had written, and Merritt said she knew and did not look up. And Pell, who was 14 and had been reading for a year, pointed out that a lease on a harbor is worth nothing if somebody else owns the road to it. It cost them another 2 days and 11 gold in inquiries, and he was completely right, and it is the reason Vale and Company bought 40 kilometers of bad road in September. The lease was signed in the counting house at Kestrel Mouth on the 2nd of October, in front of 11 members of a corporation that had not met for 4 years. 20 years, 4 gold a year for the harbor, the wall, the quay, and 11 empty warehouses, with an option to purchase at a price fixed on the day of signature. The option is the whole document. Everything else in it is furniture. Cashin had learned about options from a man who used one to take a compass off him for 35 silver. Hesta's sister signed for the corporation, put the pen down, and said that she had kept those books for 19 years and had never once expected anybody to read them. And Cashin told her, truthfully, that 19 years of a number nobody wanted was the only reason any of this was possible, and that he would be employing her from Monday. The first silt cart left Kestrel Mouth on the 14th of November, carrying 2 tons of a dead city's harbor up a bad road toward a farm that had been losing topsoil for 30 years. It sold for 11 silver, which did not cover the carriage, and Merritt wrote the loss into the ledger in red and underlined it twice. The second cart sold for 11 silver. So did the 9th and the 40th, and every single one of them for the first 4 months. Vale and Company lost 211 gold in the first year of the Kestrel Mouth lease, which was 2/3 of everything it had. And the depth at the harbor mouth went from 4/10 of a meter to 5/10, which is nothing at all, and is also the first time it had moved upward in 30 years. Cashin had that number read out at every company meeting for 6 years, and nobody was ever allowed to round it. The turn came in the third year, and it came from a direction nobody at Vale and company had planned for, which by then Cashin had stopped finding surprising. The farmers started coming to the coast to collect it themselves, because 11 silver at the quay was cheaper than 11 silver delivered, and farm carts sit idle all winter too, which removed the carriage cost from Vale and Company's side of the ledger entirely, and turned a loss of 11 silver a ton into a profit of 4. And it put 400 farm carts a month onto 40 kilometers of bad road that Vale and Company had bought, on a 14-year-old's advice, for 11 gold. The road made more money in the fourth year than the harbor lease cost for 20, and Pell never once mentioned it, which Cashin found considerably more annoying than boasting. By the sixth year, the depth at the harbor mouth was 2.1 meters, and the first coastal trader in 31 years came in on a spring tide, carrying nothing, mostly to see whether it could. 1,100 people came out to watch it, which was every single person left in Kestrel Mouth. Cashin watched it from the counting house window and did not go down, because it was not his moment, and he had worked out by then when to stay out of a room. Rank B, Trade Baron. 640 people, 11 routes, and 1 harbor with 2 meters of water in it. 6 years had gone by. He was 25, which he still found difficult, and the numbers had stopped being the interesting part sometime around the third winter. What had become interesting was that 1,100 people had turned into 4,000, and that none of the new ones had come because of the harbor. They had come because Kestrel Mouth had 1,100 empty stone houses, no guild, no lord, and a corporation that had stopped enforcing anything at all in about the year 29. Nobody in Kestrel Mouth asked anybody where they were from. It had not been a policy. It had been 30 years of nobody bothering, and it turned out to be worth more than the harbor. Cashin did not plan that. He wants it on the record 40 years later that he did not plan a single part of it and merely had the sense not to interfere. In the 7th year, the corporation of Kestrel Mouth wrote to ask whether Vale and Company intended to exercise its option to purchase. Merritt worked out the price fixed on the day of signature 7 years earlier, and had to check it 3 times, and then laughed in a way Cashin had never heard from her before. 614 gold. The corporation's entire debt, agreed as the purchase price in the year the harbor had 4/10 of a meter in it and was worth nothing at all. They paid it on the 9th of June, and on the 10th Cashin walked out along the harbor wall on his own, which he had not done since the day he sat in the mud and laughed. 1/2 kilometer of dressed stone, 2 carts wide, built 200 years earlier by people who had no machines and a great deal of confidence. He had understood how money moved for 2 entire lifetimes, and had owned nothing at the end of the first one. He stood on the end of it for about an hour in a harbor he owned, and did not do any arithmetic at all. 8 years after a lease was signed in a derelict counting house, Kestrel Mouth had 11,000 people in it, which was exactly what it had been built for. It had 4 working cranes, 11 warehouses in use, a dredger that ran 9 months a year, and no lord, no guild, and no charter of any kind. That last part was not a philosophy. It was an administrative oversight 38 years old that nobody had ever got round to correcting. Vale and Company had 640 people in the 3rd year. It had 4,100 in the 8th, and Merritt had stopped being able to name them all in the 5th. She was 60 and had reading glasses on a cord and a clerk of her own, and had entirely stopped pretending she did not enjoy any of it. Pell was 22, ran the whole northern network out of Brackmore, and still could not spell his own surname the same way twice. Oren Kell had 1,100 animals, 90 carts, and 400 men, and had twice refused to be given an office. And Cashin Vale was 27, which was the age Adrian Cole had been when he first understood what a shortage was. The company held crown schedules for 2 materials, 11 trade routes, 40 kilometers of toll road, a harbor, and a mineral lease with 16 years left on it. And on the 11th of January, in the 8th year, all of it stopped being safe in the course of a single afternoon. The Crown proposed to grant the harbor, the city, and 40 kilometers of coast to Duke Adrian Cole as a charter in recognition of 11 years on 2 frontiers. It was not an attack. That was the part that took Cashin longest to accept. Nobody had moved against him at all. A crown needs to reward a soldier. A soldier needs land. There was a piece of coast with no lord on it and no charter over it, and it had 11,000 people and a working harbor. 8 years earlier it had been worth nothing, and nobody had wanted it. He had made it worth something, and that is precisely and only why it was being taken. Pell asked what a charter would actually change. Cashin said everything, and then made himself sit down and answer it properly, because it was a fair question. A chartered lord sets the harbor dues. He sets the tolls. He grants and withdraws the right to trade, and he decides who may live inside the walls. Every one of the 4,000 people who had come to Kestrel Mouth, because nobody asked them where they were from, would be asked by somebody within a year. Merritt said they should fight it in the capital. Cashin said they would lose, and that he had watched exactly how these things are lost from a public bench 8 years earlier. You do not defeat a crown grant by arguing about it. A crown grant is a decision that has already been made and is looking for a form to be written on. What you do is find out what it is actually for, and then offer the same thing at a lower price. He had learned that at a plank counter in a cold stone room from a bored quartermaster. So he spent 4 days finding out everything there was to know about Duke Adrian Cole, and most of it he already had, because Pell had been counting the man's carts for 6 years. And what the numbers said, when he finally asked the right question, was so absurd that he checked it 11 times over 2 days. Duke Adrian Cole's territory was entirely inland, entirely upland, and produced almost nothing except soldiers. It imported 94% of its iron, 88% of its structural timber, and 61% of its surplus grain. And all 3 of those things came in over 40 kilometers of bad road that Vale and Company had bought 8 years earlier for 11 gold, on the advice of a 14-year-old. He sat in a dark office at 2 in the morning and understood with complete clarity that he could starve a duchy in about 9 weeks. He did not enjoy it. He wants that recorded. He sat there for a long time and did not enjoy it at all, because he had spent 8 years arguing that a market is not a weapon, and he had just found out at 2 in the morning that this was only ever true because he had not needed it to be one. He put it to Merritt in the morning, all of it, including the part where it would work. Merritt asked him what happens to the 11,000 people in a duchy when the iron stops, and she asked it in the specific voice of somebody who had run a household on nothing for 4 months. Cashin said that farm tools get expensive, then construction stops, then the price of everything a poor household buys goes up about 1/3, and then people start leaving. And Merritt said that was what had happened to Brackmore for 9 years before he woke up in it, and asked him whether he intended to do it to somebody else on purpose. It is the only argument he ever lost to her, and he lost it in about 11 seconds, and it changed the shape of everything that came afterwards, because the threat was real either way. What Merritt had removed was the possibility of ever actually using it, and that turned out to be the thing that made it work. He went inland to see Duke Adrian Cole on the 4th of February, with Adrian Cole driving, in the worst weather of that winter. Adrian asked, somewhere on the moor, whether he was going to threaten the man. Cashin said no, and that he was going to do something considerably worse, which was tell him the truth. Cole received him in a hall with no carpets, no plate and no tapestries, at a plain table, with 2 dogs and a fire burning whole logs. He was 57 now, grayer, and had not changed in any other respect that Cashin could identify. He did not pretend the charter was not happening, and he did not apologize for it, and Cashin respected both of those things enormously. He said the Crown had offered him a coast, that he had 11 years of frontier service and 400 men who expected land, and that he would be taking it. Cashin said he understood, and then asked him a question about grain. He asked what the duchy paid for a sack of surplus grain in March, and Duke Adrian Cole, who knew exactly what his own territory paid for everything, told him. Then Cashin told him what it had paid 9 years earlier, before Vale and Company had a road, and the difference was 31%. And then he did nothing else at all. He did not explain the figure, he did not draw the conclusion, and he did not mention iron or timber once. He had learned in a frozen yard, 9 years earlier, that the hardest and most valuable thing in any negotiation is to stop talking and let a man do his own arithmetic. Duke Adrian Cole had commanded on 2 frontiers and had spent 30 years working out what an enemy could reach. It took him about 90 seconds. He looked up and said one word, which was road, and Cashin said nothing whatsoever, which was the entire answer. Then he asked, very evenly, whether he was being threatened in his own hall, and Cashin said no, and that this was the point, and that he had come 4 days across a frozen more specifically to explain why not. He said that if he wanted to close the road, he would have closed it, and would not have traveled 4 days to discuss it, and that a threat delivered in person is a threat you have already decided not to use. Then he said the thing he had worked out on a frozen more 2 days earlier, which was that he did not want the Duke's territory, and the Duke did not actually want a port. What the Duke wanted was 400 men settled on land with an income, and a charter was simply the only instrument anybody had offered him for doing it. So Cashin offered him a different instrument, and had it written out in his satchel, because he had learned in a cold stone room never to arrive with an idea and no document. 400 freeholds on the coast at Vale and Company's cost, on land the company already held. Not tenancies, freeholds in the men's own names in perpetuity. Duke Adrian Cole read all 14 pages twice, which took an hour and 11 minutes, during which nobody in that hall said anything at all. Then he asked why a man would give away 400 pieces of his own coast to avoid a charter. He could simply have fought in the capital and probably lost. And Cashin told him the truth, which was that 400 freeholders with land in their own names are 400 people who will never permit a charter over that coast, for as long as they live. Cole put the document down and looked at him for a long moment, and said that this was the most expensive way of buying a permanent obstacle that he had ever personally encountered. Cashin agreed that it was, and said that it was also the only one that would still be working in 40 years, and that he intended to be alive in 40 years. Duke Adrian Cole signed it on the 9th of February and wrote to the Crown declining the charter on the same day, which cost him a great deal and which he never once mentioned afterwards. At the door he told Cashin that he had been wrong about him twice, and that on both occasions it had cost the Ashford Trade Guild rather than himself, which he found satisfactory. Orin asked on the moor whether that had gone well. Cashin said he did not know yet and would not know for about 30 years. The 400 freeholds were surveyed and granted between March and August, on the northern side of the bay, and they are still there. 400 former soldiers with land in their own names turned out to be, among other things, 400 people who were extremely difficult to intimidate. And in September of the 9th year, 600 people met in a converted warehouse on the quay to decide what Kestrel Mouth actually was. Cashin had wanted to leave it alone. He said so at the time, and he said it badly, and he was voted down, which he later described as the single most reassuring afternoon of his life. His argument was that a city with no charter cannot have one revoked, and that the safest constitution available to Kestrel Mouth was continuing not to have one. Hesta Bram's sister, who was 72 and had kept a harbor's books for 19 years after there was nothing to write in them, stood up and destroyed that argument in about 40 seconds. She said that a thing which exists only because nobody has noticed it is not free. It is merely lucky, and that luck had already run out once in that harbor in the year 26. Cashin sat down on the edge of the platform and did not speak again for the rest of the afternoon, because she was right, and he had been arguing from a scar rather than from arithmetic. What they wrote over the following 11 weeks is 4 pages long, has no preamble, and mentions liberty exactly nowhere. It sets harbor dues at a fixed rate. It forbids any person or company from holding more than 1/8 of the quay frontage. It requires the depth at the harbor mouth to be published every month. That last clause was Cashin's, and it is the only one he asked for, and it is a rule about a number that nobody had looked at for 30 years. The 8th of the quay clause was aimed directly at Vale and Company, and Cashin voted for it, and Merritt argued for it, and it has never once been amended. Merritt said afterwards that a company which cannot be stopped by anybody is a company which will eventually need to be, and that she would rather it be stopped by a rule she had helped write. They needed a name for the thing on the front of the document, and the argument about that took longer than the 11 weeks of clauses. Tam Oric, who was 67 by then, and had come down from Slagback specifically to be difficult, proposed calling it after the man who had leased the harbor when it was worth nothing. Cashin objected at some length and with considerable feeling, and was voted down for the second time in 11 weeks by an overwhelming margin. The document is headed, in a clerk's ordinary hand, with 4 words and no flourish whatsoever. The Free City of Vale, which Cashin thought was embarrassing then, and thought was embarrassing for the rest of his life, and never managed to get changed. The Ashford Trade Guild opened a factor's office on the quay in the 11th year, took 1/8 of a warehouse frontage exactly as the rule allowed, and paid the same dues as everybody else. Evelyn Ashford came herself once in the 12th year, and Cashin gave her the whole afternoon and found that he had been looking forward to it for 4 years. She said the guild had lost 11% of its northern trade to Vale and Company, and had made it back in 9 years by copying almost everything he did. Then she asked him, for the second time in 12 years, where a boy from a bankrupt house had learned to talk like a man closing out a position. And Cashin, who was 31, and who had not said any of it out loud in either of his lives, very nearly told her. He said his father had taught him. It was the same answer he had given a carter in a frozen yard at 19, and it was the last time he ever used it. Eveline Ashford looked at him for a while and said that she had assumed as much, and that whoever the man had been, he had clearly been very good and had clearly owned nothing. Cashin did not answer that at all, and she did not require him to, and they talked about grain prices for another 2 hours. The last thing worth recording happened on an ordinary Tuesday in the 14th year, and nobody noticed it except Cashin. Pell, who was 28 and ran 3/4 of the company, brought him a quarterly return and stood there while he read it, which he had done 4 times a year for 11 years. It was the ordinary quarterly return of an ordinary large company, and Cashin read down it the way he had read down every one of them and stopped near the bottom. Rank A Merchant Prince, 9,400 people, 63 routes, 3 ports. He looked at the employees' line for a long time, the way he had looked at it in a frozen yard 14 years earlier when it had gone from 0 to 1. Pell asked whether something was wrong with the figures. Cashin said no, and that he had hired the first one of them for 3 silver and a reading lesson. Pell, who had been 13 and could not read his own name, said that he remembered, and that the wage had been well over the going rate and everybody had said so at the time. That evening Cashin walked out along the harbor wall, which he had done perhaps 11 times in 14 years, and never once without meaning to. The depth at the harbor mouth that month was 4.1 meters, published on a board on the quay, as required by Clause 11. 4 meters is the number a trading vessel needs. It had taken 14 years, 400,000 tons, and an entire province's worth of ruined topsoil to get there. And the harbor had gone on getting deeper by itself for 6 of those years, because a bay that has stopped silting does not need dredging twice. 11,000 people live there now. About 4,000 of them arrived without being asked a single question about where they had come from. There is no lord. There is no guild monopoly. There is a 4-page document with no preamble and a clause about publishing a number every month. Cashin Vale owns 11 warehouses on that quay, which is 1/8 of the frontage, which is exactly as much as the rule allows and not a meter more. He voted for that rule. He has said in public and repeatedly that it is the single best commercial decision he ever made, and almost nobody believes him. In another world, a man called Adrian Cole died on a concrete step at 38, with a good coat and a bad reputation, and one very clear thought. He had understood how money moved better than almost anybody alive, and had never owned a shop, a route, or a single warehouse with his name over the door. There are, at the last count, 141 buildings on that coast with his name over the door, and he does not much care about any of them. What he cares about is a line in a quarterly return that reads 9,400, and a clause about a number on a board, and a village in the hills that gets 1 silver in every 8. Slagback has 311 people in it now. It had 41. There is a school, which Tam Oric complained about for 6 years and then paid to have roofed. Brackmore has a cutting yard employing 400 people, and the Vale house on the wrong side of the river is still standing, and Merritt still lives in it 4 months a year. She has been offered a house on the coast 11 times and has refused it 11 times, on the grounds that she can see the whole yard from her kitchen window and intends to keep doing so, and on the end of a harbor wall built 200 years earlier by people with no machines and a great deal of confidence. A man of 33 stands most evenings for about an hour. He does not do any arithmetic while he is out there. He has been extremely clear about that on the several occasions anybody has asked him. It is the only hour in either of his lives that he has never once tried to price.